Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere a little risky. Think stone castles, flickering torchlight, and the kind of silence that only centuries of repression can produce. You're stepping into medieval Europe, but not the one with dragons and honour and jousting tournaments. No, tonight's journey slips between the sheets of a world where female desire was taboo, dangerous, and, let's be honest, wildly misunderstood. If you're a woman who enjoys sex in the Middle Ages, you're walking a very thin, very sharp line. You could be sainted or stoned, praised in poetry or burned in public, and yes, you probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm not here for lukewarm commitment. Also, drop your city and what time it is where you are in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're watching from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You open your eyes to the clamour of a village square. Straw crunches underfoot. Church bells toll in the distance. Everything smells faintly of smoke, sweat and old bread. Women bustle past in layered wool skirts, baskets hooked in the crooks of their arms. There's a hush when someone mentions that Magda, the widow from down by the river, had another man over last night. You catch the tone. It's not admiration, it's fear, envy, judgment, and maybe a hint of fascination. Because in this world, a woman who enjoys sex, who shows it, admits it, acts on it, is a problem. She's dangerous, she's unpredictable, she's morally slippery, and worst of all, she's hard to control. Medieval society runs on control, especially over women's bodies. Your sexuality isn't yours. It belongs to your father until you're married, then it belongs to your husband, and eventually, if you're very lucky, to no one, because dead women cause less trouble. You're expected to be pure, pious, obedient. Anything outside that is not just frowned upon, it's punishable, sometimes by exile, sometimes by branding, sometimes by fire, and yet people still have sex. Of course they do. The problem is that when women enjoy it, really enjoy it, it's seen as suspicious. Your pleasure in this world is not expected. It's not even believed. If you moan, they might assume you're possessed. If you initiate, they might think you're a witch. If you seem too satisfied, you've clearly made some sort of pact, and not the marriage kind. Here's the historical fact. The church held enormous sway over cultural norms in medieval Europe, and it leaned heavily on the idea that women were spiritually weaker, more susceptible to temptation, and essentially ticking lust bombs. Think Eve, but with less clothing and worse luck. This wasn't just religious spin. It was enforced in law, literature, and medicine. A woman who enjoyed sex too openly could lose everything. Land, custody of her kids, her freedom, her life. But here's the quirky, lesser-known bit. Despite all the repression, medieval people still found ways to talk about sex. It slipped into religious sermons as cautionary tales, into court records, into the margins of illuminated manuscripts where monks doodled surprisingly graphic scenes next to Latin prayers. There are tales of women using love potions, sneaking off with knights, or dressing as men to escape convents and find lovers. Whispers of lust moved in the shadows of abbeys and castles alike. Still, for every story of secret rendezvous, there were hundreds of women who paid the price for even being suspected of enjoying themselves. That enjoyment could be read as a sign of promiscuity, madness, or supernatural influence. Take, for instance, the frequent accusation that sexually assertive women were witches, a few too many lovers, a loud laugh at the tavern, burn her, float her, strip her down and test her body for signs of the devil's mark. What starts as desire ends with ashes. Now here's where historians still debate. Were women really as repressed as the records suggest? Or are we just seeing the version the scribes wanted to write? Some scholars argue that while church and law were oppressive, everyday life had more nuance, that women, especially in rural or working-class communities, had more freedom to express desire than we think, just not in ways that were recorded. Others believe the repression was so internalized, so ingrained, that even desire itself became something women feared. You're standing there now in the square again. A whisper passes near your ear. They're talking about a woman caught with a miller's apprentice in the hayloft. No one knows what will happen yet, but the priest has been informed. You can feel the judgment in the air, sticky and sour. It wraps around you like smoke. You glance at a passing girl who meets your eyes. For a second, something unspoken flickers between you. understanding, maybe even defiance. The girl smirks, then she hurries on, so much of this world depends on silence, on pretending you feel nothing, on never admitting what your body tells you plainly. Tonight, you begin to see the cracks in that silence, the tiny rebellions, the secrets passed between friends or from mother to daughter. You start to understand how something as natural as pleasure became a battleground. And yet, you're not running away. You're curious. You're still here. Which is good, because it's going to get worse before it gets better. The square is quieter now, and you wander a little farther from the cluster of gossiping villagers, your feet crunching along a worn dirt path that curves past the church. The building looms tall and ominous, with its arched stone doorway and cross casting a long shadow across the grass. Inside, you know, is where they teach you what you're supposed to be. Not just as a believer, but as a woman. And the expectations. They're tight-laced like a corset 2 sizes too small. You're told that the ideal woman is 2 people in one, the Virgin and the Madonna. The Virgin is silent, chaste, unreachable. The Madonna is pure, maternal, sacred. You're not allowed to be sexual unless it's for bearing children, and even then, you're expected to do it with a blank expression and a whispered prayer. Lust is not your domain. Pleasure is not your goal. You are, quite literally, supposed to close your eyes and think of heaven, because God forbid you think about yourself. This binary, either untouched maiden or pious mother, leaves absolutely no room for desire. No space for the woman who enjoys the touch of her husband, or worse, a lover. There is no name for the woman who enjoys sex and survives with her dignity intact. The church sets the standard, and society, with all its sharp corners and rough edges, reinforces it with relentless consistency. But you're not the only one caught in this split identity crisis. Even noble women, the ones with soft hands and embroidered veils, are held to this impossible standard. You see them gliding past in carriages, guarded, veiled, watched. Their virginity is political, their chastity is currency. And if they're married off, usually as teenagers, it's not because anyone cares about their happiness. It's because a dowry has been arranged, and the goal is heirs, preferably male, always legitimate. And those women, many of them learn early on to hide themselves, to separate their bodies from their minds, their hearts from their instincts. A pleasurable sigh might be considered scandalous, an audible moan dangerous, and if their husbands are older, cruel or disinterested, which many are, they're expected to endure, quietly, obediently, always without complaint. Now here's your historical fact for the night. This Virgin Madonna ideal was deeply rooted in Christian theology, especially as interpreted by medieval church fathers. Think Augustine, Jerome, Aquinas, all of whom placed virginity on a pedestal and considered sexual pleasure, especially in women, a threat to spiritual purity. And this wasn't just spiritual rhetoric. It translated into real-life consequences, from legal codes to medical practices. A woman's virtue was seen as fragile and easily tarnished, like glass, or worse, like milk that's been touched by a fly. But now, let's crack open the weird side of history, because it's always there. One of the stranger medieval beliefs held that a woman's sexual desire could actually be stronger than a man's, that once awakened, she could become insatiable. Some medical texts written entirely by men warned of women who couldn't stop seeking sex after their first experience, likening them to wild animals or cursed beings. Basically, the moment you showed signs of liking it, you were no longer a person, you were a threat. Not only to men, but to the moral order of society, which makes the paradox even sharper. You're expected to remain untouched, but if you are touched and happen to enjoy it, you've stepped off the moral cliff. There is no middle ground, no safe zone, and heaven forbid someone actually sees you smile afterward. You walk past a pair of stone houses now, their shutters drawn. Somewhere inside a child cries. Somewhere else a woman bubble laughs quietly, too quietly for it to be free. You're struck by how much of this world is hidden, how many lives are lived behind walls and beneath veils, all shaped by rules you didn't make and can't challenge. And yet the Madonna image still haunts you. The idea that even if you are a mother, even if you've done everything right, you must remain emotionally chaste. You must love without wanting, nurture without needing, sacrifice without enjoying a moment of physical connection, lest someone think you're too earthly, too base, too human. Some scholars argue this split identity was designed deliberately, that by forcing women into binary roles, pure or sinful, society could more easily control them. If you behave, you're a saint. If you stray, you're a harlot. The space in between doesn't exist. And so most women learn to live in costume. Even when they burn inside, they wear the mask of modesty. Even when they ache with longing, they bow their heads in silence. But other scholars push back. They point to letters, poems, songs passed in secret. They argue that women found ways to reclaim pleasure, even if only briefly, even if only in metaphor. There's evidence that noble women sometimes wrote of their own desire, couched in spiritual language to avoid punishment, a love of God that looked suspiciously like a yearning for flesh. Was it intentional, or just the only language they were allowed to use? Either way, the message is clear. You are meant to serve, not to want. And if you do want, you must hide it so well that not even you can find it again. As the sun dips lower, casting everything in a warm golden hue, you feel the weight of centuries pressing down, of expectation, of judgment, of impossible standards wrapped in the language of virtue. You begin to understand how deeply this world fears female pleasure, not just because it's powerful, but because it's unpredictable. It can't be taxed, it can't be measured, it threatens to rewrite the rules. So tonight, you sit with that. Not just the fear, but the defiance. The soft, flickering flame of desire that refused to die, even under layers of linen and shame. And you wonder, what happens next? What happens when the body says yes, even when the world screams no? You're still by the church, but now the bells have stopped ringing, and the shadows stretch long across the grass. You find yourself watching a procession of villagers pass by the heavy wooden doors. Some kneel before going inside, others cast only a wary glance before hurrying on. One thing's for sure, the church is everywhere, not just in stone buildings or priestly robes, but sewn into every thought, every rule, every whispered warning passed from mother to daughter. It's not just that sex is frowned upon, it's that the church believes your desire might open the gates of hell. To be a woman with sexual curiosity in this world is to be told over and over again that your body is a tool of the devil. The pulpit doesn't just suggest this, it practically sings it. You hear it in sermons, read it in texts written in scratchy Latin by monkish hands, and feel it in every judgmental glance when you laugh too loudly or wear your belt a little loose at the waist. You're told that your sexuality is dangerous, not just to you, but to everyone around you. If a man is tempted by your hair, your walk, your laughter, it's your fault. If a priest feels desire during confession, your voice must have been too sweet. If a plague wipes through the town and someone remembers you smiled at the blacksmith last week, well, clearly you brought sin upon the village. The church doesn't mess around when it comes to sex, especially female sex. Here's a historical fact for you. During the medieval period, especially in the High and Late Middle Ages, theologians developed detailed and sometimes absolutely wild rules about when and how sex was permissible. It had to be within marriage, of course, and only for the purpose of procreation. But even within those narrow confines, it got weirder. Certain positions were considered more holy than others. Days of the week were restricted. You weren't supposed to have sex on Sundays, Fridays, or during Lent. Honestly, you start to wonder when people ever had the time. For women, these restrictions weren't just about timing or technique. They were about control. If you showed too much enthusiasm, even in marriage, you might be accused of being possessed by a lustful spirit. There were stories of demons that entered through your mouth or belly, twisting your thoughts and leading you astray. Pleasure, if it came at all, had to be accidental, quiet, preferably unnoticed. And yet here's the strange fringe belief of the moment. Some clerics genuinely thought that sex couldn't result in pregnancy unless the woman enjoyed it. No joke. This pseudo-medical idea, passed down from earlier classical sources, was used both to justify spousal coercion and to deny rape accusations. After all, if she got pregnant, she must have liked it, right? You can feel your jaw clench just thinking about how this logic was weaponized. Against widows, against peasants, against girls barely old enough to know what a womb even was. This leads us into one of the darkest corners of the medieval sexual labyrinth. Consent wasn't just blurry, it practically didn't exist. Legally, a woman's ability to say yes or no was tied entirely to her marital status and social class. If you were married, your husband owned your body. He could take what he wanted, when he wanted, and the law would back him up. If you weren't married, but were assaulted, You had to prove that you screamed, that you resisted, that you didn't enjoy it, and even then, the shame often stuck to you, not the attacker. Which brings us to a brutal reality. You can't win. If you say no, you're a prude or a liar. If you say yes, you're a whore. If you say nothing, they'll fill in the blanks for you. And the story they write will almost always be cruel. Now, scholars still argue about how much women internalise this view of themselves. Some think that after centuries of sermons and social enforcement, women came to believe that their own desires were evil, that they learned to suppress, to forget, to fear their own bodies. Others believe there was more resistance than we've assumed, that in small acts of rebellion, a smile, a touch, a whisper-good joke, women pushed back against the crushing moral framework. They may not have had the words for consent, but they had instincts, cleverness, and, occasionally, opportunity. And sometimes, very rarely, they even had allies. A husband who didn't see his wife as property, a priest who bent the rules in private, a healer or midwife who shared quiet knowledge under the guise of herbs and teas. These moments were rare but real. They flicker through the records like candlelight, brief and beautiful. But most of the time you're on your own, standing at the edge of a system that's designed to keep you silent and judge the moment you speak. Even your anatomy is misunderstood. Medieval medical texts mostly based their understanding of the female body on theories from Galen, a Roman physician who believed women were just inverted men. Your genitals, he claimed, were the same as a man's, just inside out. Elegant, right? This led to all kinds of confusion, especially when it came to diagnosing illnesses that involved sexual or reproductive organs. Basically, if anything went wrong down there, it was either your fault or God's punishment. And so you walk through this world aware of every step, every glance, every word, aware that your body is seen as a danger zone, that your desire, should you dare to feel it, is best buried deep where no one, even you, can find it. Still, something inside you whispers that the rules aren't the whole truth, that behind every cautionary tale is a reality more complex, that other women like you have felt the pull of want and wondered if they were alone. You're not even close. You're sitting on a low stone wall now, watching the village slowly empty into doorways and shadows as dusk settles in. Candles blink on behind shuttered windows. The air thickens with wood smoke and the faint tang of animals settling in their stalls. You should feel calm, but instead you're unsettled, because the question still hangs over you like an unspoken sentence. What does happen to a woman who enjoys sex in this world? Let's say you do. You're married, or maybe not. You're discreet, or maybe reckless. You find someone who makes your breath hitch and your skin buzz. You lean into the thrill instead of shrinking from it. Maybe you even make the first move. At first, it's just a glance across the bread stall, a brush of fingers when passing a jug, a shared grin that lingers half a heartbeat too long. And then, one night, the barn door creaks behind you and you're not afraid. You want it. You enjoy it. You just made a very big mistake. See, in the eyes of medieval society, your pleasure isn't a personal matter. It's a public threat. A woman moaning in the dark is one breath away from being accused of witchcraft. It's not even metaphorical. There are documented cases of women whose sexual enjoyment during consensual, or even marital sex was used against them. Too vocal, too eager, too unnatural, and suddenly you're not a wife or a lover anymore. You're a suspect. There's a direct link, twisted and ancient, between female pleasure and demonic influence. Theologians of the time genuinely believed that women's lust opened the door for Satan to slip in. If you felt too much, maybe the devil was inside you. If you made a man stumble, maybe you did it on purpose, because you were working for hell. Welcome to the logic loop. You're damned if you do, and probably still damned if you don't. And it gets darker. The infamous Malleus Maleficarum, written in the late 1400s, just barely post-medieval but firmly in the spirit, makes this link explicit. It claims that women are more carnal, more easily tempted, and more likely to consort with demons via sex. Succubi, incubi, Satan himself slipping into dreams or under bed sheets. The authors say women are by nature instruments of Satan, and their sexuality is his favourite weapon. You don't have to be caught mid-ritual to be in danger. Just being known for enjoying yourself might be enough to start rumours, and those rumours could burn you alive. Now, here's a real historical fact. During the height of the witch-hunting craze, many accused women were single, widowed, or otherwise outside the protection of a man. But before that, in the early and high medieval periods, sexual suspicion often began with behaviour. Women who were too expressive, too flirtatious, or, heaven forbid, openly sexual were already halfway to condemnation. The church wanted quiet, modest obedience. Anything louder than that drew attention, and in this era, attention is rarely good. One quirky footnote in this tragic system: some folk beliefs held that a woman could actually seduce or control a man by engaging in sex during a full moon, or while eating certain herbs. Imagine that. Oregano and moonlight turning you into a sorceress. You'd laugh if it weren't so deadly serious. In certain parts of Europe, these beliefs were enough to land women in church court, facing excommunication or worse. They called it fornication with intention, as if wanting it made it criminal. Now, there's still an academic debate about how widespread these accusations were. Some historians argue that the image of the lusty witch is overblown in modern retellings, shaped by later fears and not as prominent during most of the medieval period. Others counter that while the burning times came later, the seeds were sown early. That even before laws codified witchcraft, society already linked sexual expression in women with danger, heresy and supernatural corruption. Either way, the effect is the same. Your desire is marked, monitored and always suspect. Even your neighbours, who smile at you in the market and nod politely at mass, are watching. They see how you stand, how you speak, how you look at that travelling tanner who's been hanging around the well. And if they decide you're too free, too bold, too alive, then comes the whisper campaign. It starts with a question: did you hear what she did? Then a warning: best not let your daughters near her. Then the escalation: I heard she wasn't alone in the woods last week. And finally the verdict: she's not right, she's dangerous, she's unclean. The punishment might not come from the church at first. It might start with cold shoulders, lost business, a landlord who won't renew your lease, a priest who suddenly refuses you communion. And then, if someone has a grudge or a need to distract the village from their own sins, they might accuse you formally. That's when things get serious. You could be summoned to a church trial. You'd stand before priests or local judges and be asked bluntly if you've lain with demons, if your pleasure came from Satan, if you cast spells on men to make them desire you, if you've corrupted the moral fabric of your community by smiling at the wrong time. You might laugh, thinking no one could possibly believe such nonsense, but they do. The same people who heard you sing at the harvest festival, who tasted your pies at feast days, they'll swear they saw you with glowing eyes or a serpent on your shoulder. Why? Because they're scared. Because they envy your freedom. Or because fear is easier to live with when it has a target. And so you, a woman who simply enjoyed herself, become the focus of a moral purge. That's the dark magic of this world. Not the spells or the demons or the wild accusations, but the way it turns your body against you. The way it tells you that pleasure is proof of evil, that your moan is a confession, that your desire makes you a threat. And even knowing all this, you still feel it. Desire, soft and stubborn, rising like smoke from a hidden fire. Because you're human. Because no law, no sermon, no accusation can erase that. And maybe, just maybe, that's the most rebellious thing of all. Morning in the village comes with a chill that creeps into your bones before the sun even clears the treetops. You stir from a restless sleep, blanket tucked tightly around your shoulders, and step outside to the sound of roosters, clattering buckets, and gossip already rippling across the cobblestones. The rumour about the baker's niece, that she was seen smiling too brightly at a visiting friar, has started to mutate. Now it's said she bewitched him. Her cheeks were flushed, they say, her eyes glassy. You roll your own eyes but keep your head down. You know better than to look amused. Laughter gets you noticed. Being noticed gets you judged. And if you're judged, well, the consequences go far beyond bruised feelings or social exile. In this world, misbehaving women often find themselves subjected to another horror dressed up as science: medieval medicine. Let's talk about your body for a moment. Not the way you feel in it, though that matters, but the way the world sees it. The way men, especially those with books and authority, try to explain it. And to them, you're a mystery. A problem. A walking, talking source of disease, sin, and sexual danger. Now here's a legitimate historical fact that might make you gag a little. Medieval medicine believed in something called the wandering womb. Yes, they thought your uterus could literally detach and float around your body. Feeling faint? Your womb wandered to your head. Breathless or anxious? That's your womb pushing on your lungs. And what's the cure? Usually marriage, pregnancy or sex, with a man of course. A disobedient womb could be lured back into place by fumigation, somewhere near your lower half, or by placing sweet scents near your vagina and foul smells near your nose. Imagine lying in bed while a monk wafts burned herbs between your legs like some deranged incense ceremony. Relaxing, right? And here's the really insidious part, the belief that your sexual pleasure could be both cause and cure of illness. If you're too lustful, that's dangerous. But if you're not lustful enough, say, if your womb gets restless, you're also sick. Either way, you need a man to fix you. Your body becomes a riddle, and male authority claims to be the only one who can solve it. The same physicians and clergymen who fear your desire are obsessed with it. They write pages and pages about how women feel more pleasure than men, how it overwhelms their rational minds. Some medical texts even suggest that women should be kept satisfied to avoid hysteria. Not because they care about your joy, of course, just because it keeps you quiet. And if you think this only applies to grown women, think again. Some treatments for young girls accused of inappropriate behaviour involved bleeding, forced baths, or having them examined by male physicians under the guise of correction. The idea wasn't to understand desire, it was to tame it, to domesticate it, to punish it until it folds in on itself. Quirky detail? In a few fringe regions, some healers, usually women, claimed they could cure a wandering womb with chants and gentle massage. These were midwives or local wise women who straddled the line between accepted medicine and suspicious magic. They often knew more about female anatomy than the university-trained doctors, but they walked a razor's edge. One wrong move, one too effective remedy, and they'd be labelled witches. And yet, despite all this madness, women kept passing knowledge down, in hushed voices behind kitchen doors, in coded recipes written in herb books, in rituals disguised as hygiene. A bath of thyme and lavender might smell lovely, but it also eased menstrual pain. A tonic for nerves might conveniently dull desire, or awaken it. You had to be careful, you had to be clever, but the knowledge never disappeared. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about how much real power these midwives and folk healers had. Some argue they were respected within their communities, protected by networks of women who knew the value of their work. Others believe they were always preccariously close to being accused of sorcery, their usefulness tolerated only until fear took over. What's clear is that they operated it in a delicate space, one where female knowledge and female pleasure intersected, and that intersection terrified the people in charge. You pass one of those women now, her name is Alditha. She's old, hunched, and smells like rosemary and goat milk. People nod politely when she walks by, but they don't invite her in. You hear stories about what she does with herbs, with oils, with murmured Latin that's a little too smooth for comfort. No one says it outright, but everyone knows she's the one to see if your daughter's having fits, or if a young bride hasn't conceived, or, though it's never spoken, if someone needs to quietly not be pregnant. And still, Alditha smiles. There's something fearless about her. Or maybe she's just too old to care. You can't help but admire it. Because while the priests and physicians talk about the dangers of your body, women like Alditha remember that it's yours, that it can give life, yes, but it can also give you life, not just through childbearing, but through sensation, through connection, through pleasure. And no matter how tightly the church grips the reins, it can't quite erase that. So maybe that's the real threat. Not demons, not wandering wombs, but women who know themselves, women who don't need permission to feel, women who, despite it all, refuse to apologise for their bodies. You keep walking. As the wind picks up and your cloak flutters behind you, you realise something. For all their rules and sermons and so-called cures, they're afraid of you. Not because of what you do, but because of what you might do if you stopped listening. And that's worth remembering. The wind sharpens as the day stretches on, slicing through your cloak and curling around your ankles. The village has settled into its rhythm. Fires lit, soup simmering, children running wild in woolen tunics while their mothers shout half-hearted warnings. You watch it all from the side, still thinking about the strange, terrible dance medieval women had to do with their own bodies. And as you follow the worn path that twists between the cottages and the pastures beyond, a darker truth settles in. In this world, you don't get to choose what happens to your body. Not really. Because the concept of consent, as you know it today, simply doesn't exist. That's not exaggeration. That's not modern bias. That's the cold historical reality. You can't give permission if you're not seen as someone with permission to give. And in medieval Europe, women, especially married ones, were not legal entities in their own right. Once you married, you became feme converted, literally covered woman. You were legally absorbed into your husband, your property, your voice, your autonomy gone. So if your husband wants to sleep with you, it's not about consent. It's about his rights. And if he forces you, that isn't a crime, that's just marriage. You walk past a half-crumbling cottage now, its door hanging slightly ajar. Inside you catch a glimpse of a woman staring down at her lap, unmoving, while a man paces back and forth behind her. You don't need to hear the words to know what's happening. The stillness in her shoulders says everything. She's checked out, her body still here, but her mind already far away. That is one kind of silence medieval women learned to master, the silence of survival. Here's your historical fact. Marital rape was not only legal in medieval Europe, it wasn't even conceived of as a possibility. A man had a right to his wife's body, and the idea that she might not want sex was irrelevant. That didn't start to shift until many centuries later, and even now the remnants of that idea echo uncomfortably loud in some corners of the world. But what if you weren't married? Couldn't you just say no, sometimes, if you were lucky, and rich, and in favour with the right men? But more often no was a word with no protection behind it. If you were a peasant girl caught alone near the mill, or a servant cornered in the storeroom, or a travelling merchant's daughter seen talking too long to a stable hand, your reputation could be destroyed in an instant, and if someone forced you and you went to the authorities, you would have to prove it. In a court run by men, with rules written by men, judged by a jury of local respectable men, you'd be asked if you screamed, if you fought, if you bled, and then quietly if you'd ever done it before. Because here's the real kicker. If they decide you're not a virgin, even if you were raped, it's not seen as rape anymore. Because a woman who's spoiled must have wanted it. Her body remembers, her body responds, her body betrays her. There's a fringe, disturbing belief that pops up in some 12th and 13th century legal and religious writings, that a woman cannot become pregnant unless she experiences pleasure during the act. You've already heard this twisted bit once, but now you see how deeply it's woven into law. This myth wasn't just medical, it was judicial. It was used as evidence. Pregnant from an assault? Then it must not have been assault. Case closed, punishment denied, and you once again are left with the shame. Even if you don't become pregnant, there are other consequences. Your reputation is ruined, your dowry might be returned, your father might disown you. If you're lucky, a nunnery will take you in. If not, you might end up begging for scraps, or worse, labelled as a whore whether you ever took coin or not. And it gets even worse for enslaved women and lower-class servants, whose bodies were quite literally considered part of their master's property. Consent? Completely irrelevant. Their ability to resist or report abuse was non-existent. Their stories rarely made it into the written record, but you know they existed. Scrubbed floors with blood on them, bruises hidden beneath wool sleeves, babies born without fathers' names, ghosts in the margins of history. One strange, somewhat overlooked practice tells its own kind of tale. The custom of rough music, a form of public shaming where villagers would bang pots, sing mocking songs and parade effigies around the homes of people accused of sexual impropriety. It was often used against women who were seen as promiscuous, or who remarried too quickly after a husband's death. Sometimes it was used to shame men, but more often the women bore the brunt of it. A sexual woman, whether wronged or willing, became the community's scapegoat. Scholars still argue over the nuance of these cases. Some say that women were more resilient and had more agency than we assume, that they used the church courts to their advantage, that they formed supportive female networks, that they navigated the system with quiet defiance. Others argue that any advantage was a thin illusion, and that real power was always just out of reach. What both sides agree on, though, is that women's voices in this era were shaped more by fear than freedom. You pause now at a narrow bridge that crosses a slow-moving stream. A young girl kneels nearby, washing laundry, her sleeves rolled high and her knuckles raw from the cold. She looks up when she sees you, and for a moment her gaze is sharp, alert, more curious than afraid. She can't be more than 14, and yet you can feel she already knows what the world expects from her. Probably already knows how to hide when certain men are nearby. Already knows to laugh off uncomfortable comments. Already knows how to disappear into herself if she has to. And you wonder, how many girls like her never get the chance to say no? How many never learn that it's even allowed? The truth is brutal. This is a world where your pleasure is criminal and your pain is invisible, where your body is a battleground owned by others, where your silence is taken as consent, and your consent is treated like silence. And even though you're just passing through, you feel it in your bones. The exhaustion, the injustice, the aching need to scream when no one will listen. And maybe that's what lingers most. Not the rules or the laws or the sermons, but the loneliness. The aching silence of millions of women who wanted to say no, or yes, or anything, but were never given the chance. The sun rises higher now, burning off the last threads of mist clinging to the fields beyond the village. You walk the edge of a barley plot, the stalks still green in the season's early warmth, and from here the thatched rooftops look almost peaceful. But you know better. You've seen the fear behind curtains, the shame stitched into every woman's movements. And now you wonder, if female desire was so dangerous, so tightly bound and condemned in the upper classes and church-controlled spaces, what about the women who didn't live in stone manors or shadowy cloisters? What about the peasant women? The ones hauling water, grinding grain and living in the dirt, and you'd think maybe they had fewer rules, maybe less pressure to maintain the Virgin Madonna image. After all, no portraits were being painted of them, no lands tied to their dowries, no bishops watching their every move, and yes, there was more breathing room in some ways. Peasant women weren't expected to be untouchable goddesses. They were expected to work, to bleed and bear children and survive. They had mud under their nails, calluses on their palms, and a far more practical relationship with their own bodies. But here's the twist. Just because society didn't put them on a pedestal didn't mean it treated them with more compassion. In fact, the opposite. You walk past a field where women are bent over rows of cabbages, skirts hitched and aprons full. Their laughter drifts up in bursts, coarse, unfiltered, the kind that tastes like defiance. They're young mostly, though a few wear the face of someone who's seen too much. And they know what the world thinks of them. Because here's the fact, as always, if you're a peasant woman in the medieval world and you show desire, or even just get caught up in it, no one pretends you were seduced. No one writes sad poems about your fall from grace. You're not a tragic figure. You're just a problem, a slut, a vessel, maybe a liar. And if you become pregnant, you'll be judged far more harshly than the man who left you with the consequence. A rich girl gets warnings and chaperones. You get a ruined reputation and maybe a broken jaw. If you live in a manor, you're expected to guard your virtue. If you live in a hut, you're expected to give it up and shut up. But the thing is, peasant women still felt desire. Of course they did. It didn't matter that they worked 14 hours a day or barely had shoes. They laughed with boys in the fields, danced at festivals, stole kisses in the dark, just like anyone else. Their bodies didn't ask permission from class structures. They wanted what they wanted, same as the noble women hiding behind veils and gates. And that's where it gets complicated, because while desire is universal, punishment is not. A peasant woman who gets caught with a lover can't fall back on family influence or a conveniently arranged marriage. If she gets pregnant, she's often forced to confess in front of the whole parish. In some towns, women had to wear special clothes to mark them as unmarried mothers. Red sashes, torn veils, sometimes even stand in the back of church during Mass, heads down, as a visible symbol of disgrace. Meanwhile, the father, if named, might face a fine. Maybe. If he's not already gone, here's a quirky fact. In some regions, communities organised bed inspections to make sure newly married couples were actually consummating their marriage. Neighbours, midwives, even priests were involved, checking for signs of virginity or blood-stained sheets. You'd think, given this obsession with proving a woman's purity, that a man's fidelity might also be inspected. Spoiler, it wasn't. And if a peasant woman tried to resist a man's advances, good luck, especially if he was higher up the social ladder. A landowner could assault a servant or tenant's daughter, and the legal consequences were often non-existent. If she protested, she could be thrown out of her home. If she reported it, she'd be accused of seduction, or worse, witchcraft. The accusation could turn her into the villain of the story she never asked to be in. There's one recorded case from 13th century France, where a peasant girl tried to bring charges against a local steward who attacked her. Her testimony was dismissed on the grounds that she had previously been seen walking alone with him near a stable. She must have wanted it, the record notes. Case dismissed. Girl punished. Life ruined. That wasn't rare. That was typical. And yet, despite everything, peasant women still fought back in whatever ways they could. Some used sharp tongues and sharper elbows, some found solidarity in each other. They shared warnings about certain men. They passed down old tricks, herbs that delayed a cycle, infusion to reduce desire, or stifle it completely if needed. It wasn't empowerment exactly, it was survival. But even that, especially that, carried its own form of resistance. Scholars argue over just how much power these women had. Some believe the peasant class had more sexual freedom simply because they weren't watched as closely. Others insist the freedom was an illusion, that the lack of surveillance only made it easier to hurt them in silence. What they agree on is this. Poor women bore the brunt of medieval hypocrisy. They were expected to keep quiet when used, to disappear when pregnant, and to smile when shamed. And through it all, desire didn't go away. It just went underground, hidden in field songs, in winter dances, in stolen glances, and whispered names scratched into barn walls. You pass one now, an old timber wall warped with age. Someone carved a heart into it with 2 initials, A+M. You wonder who they were, if they were punished, if they were caught, if it was worth it. Because sometimes, even in a world that crushes you, wanting something, someone, can feel like the only thing that's real. And in the end, peasant women didn't have the luxury of poetry or privacy, but they still had skin, they still had breath, they still had want. And that, more than any church ruling or noble law, is what made them dangerous. The road bends uphill now, away from the fields and toward the manor house that watches over the village like a stone sentinel. Its flags hang limp in the breeze, the walls thick with ivy and rumours. You pause at the edge of the orchard below, looking up at the leaded windows, and you can't help but wonder what goes on behind them, especially when the torches are lit and the chamber doors are closed. Because as grim as it's been for the peasant girls scraping by in the mud, there's another, more gilded prison awaiting women born into silk. If you're beautiful, educated, clever, and willing to dance on the edge of what's acceptable, you might become one of the few women in this era with actual sexual agency, a courtesan. But don't get excited. It's not the fantasy you're thinking of. The word courtesan conjures up images of velvet gowns, witty repartee, and lovers flinging coins after a night of poetry and passion. And yes, sometimes it was like that, especially in the later medieval period, in the courts of Italy or France. But more often, being a courtesan was walking a razor's edge between power and punishment. You had access to men who mattered. You might even influence them. But your power was always borrowed, never owned. And if you misstepped, if you aged, if you spoke too boldly, if a rival whispered too loudly, you'd fall. Fast, hard, with no net waiting below. You walk now past a cluster of younger women gathered beneath a tree, maids and companions to the lady of the manor, judging by their fine but not too fine clothing. One is reading from a scrap of verse, the others giggle, blush, and roll their eyes. But the way they lean in tells you they're listening, they're learning, and they're hoping, maybe foolishly, that they might one day find themselves desired in a way that offers more than shame. That's where courtesans lived, in that space between disgrace and fascination. They weren't wives, they weren't prostitutes. They were something in between, and in many ways more threatening than either, because they chose their lovers, chose when to speak, when to hold a gaze, when to press a fingertip to a man's chest and say, "Not tonight." They used their minds as much as their bodies. They knew poetry, politics, art. They wrote letters more eloquent than half the bishops in Europe. And for all that, they were still disposable. Here's your historical fact. In the Italian courts of the late 14th and 15th centuries, high-class courtesans were often educated by design. Some were trained in Latin, rhetoric, music and dance, skills that made them more appealing to nobles and diplomats. Cities like Venice had entire unofficial economies orbiting around these women. They were known, sought out, protected by some, reviled by others. The church labelled them dangerous. Powerful men whispered their names in bed and denied them in public. But that's Italy. What about earlier? What about the woman in England or France or the Holy Roman Empire in the 1200s or 1300s who enjoyed sex and wasn't married? She might have found herself becoming a mistress, not in the modern sense of a discreet affair, but a more formal role. Some noble women were unofficially kept by lords or kings. They received gifts, lands, even titles in rare cases, but this arrangement was always precarious, because while a man could flaunt his mistresses and be seen as virile, a woman who accepted the arrangement was still branded a seductress, a sinner, or a social climber. And let's not forget the whisper network. Servants saw everything. Ladies-in-waiting traded secrets like currency. One too many signs of passion, an unguarded laugh, a red mouth, a missing underdress, and a woman's position could collapse overnight. One of the most peculiar things, courtesans were sometimes consulted on matters of politics or war. Their pillow talk held real weight. Yet they couldn't vote, own property freely, or speak in court without a man's permission. It's a contradiction that makes your teeth ache. Desired and dismissed, celebrated and condemned. There's a lesser-known figure you might like, Ninon de l'Enclos. Technically a bit after the medieval era, but her story is a continuation of this trend. She was witty, brilliant, independent, and famously unrepentant about her lovers. She wrote letters defending pleasure as a woman's right, and she lived to an old age, respected and resented in equal measure. Not burned, not exiled, just very carefully ignored by the powers that be. A survivor, a warning, a legend. But even in the high medieval period, traces of this archetype show up. Songs and poems about courtly love often revolve around unattainable women, married, noble, beautiful, and sexually captivating. The troubadour sings, sighs, and suffers. The lady listens, encourages, and denies. But the undercurrent? It's all about her power, her ability to stir desire, to command emotion, to break hearts from behind lace fans. Of course it's a fantasy. Most real women with that kind of charisma were carefully managed, married off, or, in some cases, eliminated. And yet the stories lingered, because even the men who feared that kind of woman wanted her, and even the women who feared becoming her, envied her just a little. Here's the quirky fringe fact for this chapter. Some noble women, particularly in more progressive courts, kept erotic journals. Yes, actual diaries where they wrote about their dreams, desires, and fantasies. Most were destroyed by family or church after death, but a few fragments remain. One woman described a dream where she seduced a knight using only her eyes. Another wrote about her husband with surprising, almost scandalous affection. These weren't just dirty thoughts, they were acts of rebellion, proof that even behind silken stone the fire still burned. But let's not romanticize too much. These women walked a tightrope every day. A mistress who failed to keep her lover's favour could be married off in disgrace, sent to a nunnery, or, if things got really dicey, accused of sorcery or treason. No matter how clever or desirable she was, the structure she lived in was rigged. It always had been. And yet, they carved out moments, slivers of control, spaces where they could choose. And in a time where most women were taught not to even want, that's more revolutionary than it seems. You look back at the manor one last time. Somewhere in there, someone is whispering into someone else's ear. Maybe it's love, maybe it's strategy, maybe it's both. But behind every glance, every carefully folded letter, every stolen kiss, is a woman who for once knows what she wants. The manor fades into the distance behind you, its towers disappearing into the haze of mid-morning light as your feet find a narrow dirt road winding toward a quieter corner of the countryside. The air here is heavier, somehow, humid with stillness, muffled like a secret being kept. You've left the world of noble women and courtesans for something even more cloistered. The monastery. Stone walls rise ahead, wrapped in creeping ivy and silence. This is where the church hides its women, or depending on who you ask, where women hide from the world. But make no mistake, just because they're cloistered doesn't mean desire dies at the door. You approach the convent's outer gate slowly. The building is old, older than the village behind you, and the heavy wooden door is studded with iron like a fortress. A single bell hangs above it, unmoving. You half expect to see a ghostly nun glide by, head bowed, rosary clutched tight. But what you don't expect, what you couldn't expect, is the flicker of suppressed giggling echoing through a side window, followed by the soft thump of something falling. A slipper? A book? A secret? Because the truth is, the convent isn't quite the cold, sexless place you imagine. In fact, in some cases, it's the exact opposite. Medieval convents were supposed to be places of spiritual discipline and self-denial. A woman entered to become a bride of Christ, to renounce earthly pleasures and submit to a life of prayer, fasting and service. But the reality? Much messier. Many women didn't choose convent life freely. Some were forced in by their families. Too many daughters, not enough dowries. Some were widows with nowhere else to go. Others were rebellious types, clever and sharp-tongued, shuffled off to a convent as the punishment. And once they were inside, well, let's just say not everyone was as devout as the church might have hoped. Here's a historical fact that might surprise you. Not all convents were equal. Wealthy abbeys, especially those backed by noble families, had access to libraries, music, even small luxuries like imported wine or sugar. And while rules about contact with the outside world existed, they were bent. Bishops looked the other way. Nobles made generous donations to keep their daughters comfortable. And some convents developed a reputation for being a bit relaxed in their interpretation of chastity. Letters survive, dozens of them, written by nuns who talk openly about longing, about sensual dreams, about feelings they struggle to name but clearly feel. And sometimes those feelings weren't just poetic. There are records, tucked into dusty ecclesiastical archives, of nuns engaging in sexual relationships, with priests, with visiting monks, and yes, sometimes with each other. This wasn't common exactly, but it wasn't unheard of, and it wasn't always punished as harshly as you'd think. You hear the clang of a bucket now, someone drawing water from the convent well. A young nun walks past, robes swishing, her cheeks pink from effort or something else. She glances at you, then away quickly, but for a split second you see it in her eyes. That spark, that humanity. She may have given up the world, but her body didn't forget how to feel. One of the most talked about cases involves a 14th century German abbess who was caught in a relationship with a local priest. Their letters were full of passion, their trysts regular, and their excuse? Spiritual union. It's unclear what punishment, if any, was doled out. Some say the priest was reassigned, the abbess quietly forgiven, or quietly watched. But the story spread, of course, not because it was shocking, because it was familiar. Here's your quirky fringe fact for tonight. Some religious orders believed in exorcising desire from nuns through physical punishment. If a woman confessed to lustful thoughts, she might be subjected to cold baths, public confession, or even flogging. Not always by a priest, sometimes by her fellow nuns. A twisted combination of guilt and penance, often more traumatic than purifying. And yet many of these same communities kept images of Christ that bordered on erotic. Wounds dripping, eyes half-lidded, bodies stretched in some unsuffering. You don't have to squint too hard to see the sublimated desire pulsing beneath the prayers. It's no wonder then that scholars still debate what these convents really were. Some argue they offered women unique autonomy, away from marriage, childbirth and male control, a place to think, to write, to teach, and there's truth in that. Nuns preserved texts, ran schools and managed property. Some abbesses wielded more power than local lords, but others argue that the convent was simply a quieter cage, one where desire didn't disappear, it just turned inward, becoming guilt, hallucination, or sin confessed in the dark of the chapel. You walk beneath a crumbling archway now, and a carving catches your eye. 2 doves, beaks touching, wings curled inward. The symbol of peace, or perhaps intimacy. You wonder who carved it. A nun with too much time on her hands? A visiting mason who left behind a memory? Either way, it makes you think of the invisible stories these walls hold, of women who whispered names at night into straw pillows, of hands that brushed too long when passing communion wafers, of prayers that ended with sighs too deep to be purely spiritual. And you think maybe that convents were never truly about erasing desire. Maybe they were about hiding it, taming it, folding it into layers of ritual and silence. But it always found a way to leak out, through ink, through dreams, through glances, because even here in this most sacred of spaces, the body remembers what it wants. You linger at the edge of the convent garden as bells begin to chime in the chapel. Somewhere behind the walls, a chant rises, beautiful, mournful, steady. But beneath the music, beneath the piety, there's something else, a hum, a heartbeat. Because even in holy places, even under vows of silence and chastity, desire never dies. It just waits. The chapel bells fade into the stillness swallowed by the countryside as you walk away from the convent's looming stone. The path narrows here, turning into more of a trail than a road, winding through a patch of woods where light filters down in long golden blades. The quiet is welcome, but it doesn't feel restful. It feels tense, like the forest itself is listening. Because now you've crossed into the part of the medieval world where guilt is no longer a whisper, it's a sentence, a punishment, a spectacle. And if you're a woman accused of enjoying sex outside the rules, You don't just lose your reputation, you face something much darker, public proof of your innocence or your shame. You've reached the place where trials begin, not in courts with powdered wigs and neat rows of jurors. No, here it's more medieval, literal, physical, painful, trial by ordeal. Let's say someone accuses you. Maybe your neighbour saw you slip into the woods with a boy. Maybe you were raped and the village decides you must have invited it. Maybe a married man takes too much interest in you and needs to clear his name. The reason doesn't matter. The accusation sticks. And suddenly, you're no longer a person. You're a problem to be solved. A question to be answered with fire or water or knives. Here's your historical fact. Trial by ordeal was a common method of determining guilt in early and high medieval Europe, especially before legal systems standardised evidence and testimony. And yes, it was often used for crimes related to sexual behaviour. Adultery, fornication, and accusations of being unchaste could all end with a woman being forced to prove her innocence in horrifying ways. One popular method, the ordeal of cold water. You would be bound hand and foot and lowered into a river or a pit filled with water. If you floated, it meant the water, symbol of purity, rejected you. Guilty. If you sank, congratulations, you were innocent. Assuming someone managed to pull you out before you drowned, which wasn't always a given. Another favourite? The ordeal of fire. You might be forced to carry a red-hot iron a certain distance or walk across glowing embers. Your hands would be bound afterward, and then the wounds were inspected a few days later. If they healed cleanly, miraculously, you were pure. If they festered, you were condemned. Again, it's not hard to guess how often the outcome was skewed by who was watching and what they wanted to see. And then there were the even darker variations. Some women were subjected to invasive tests for virginity or signs of sexual corruption. These weren't just humiliating, they were assaults wrapped in the language of justice. A woman's body became evidence, dissected and discussed by men who claimed moral authority. And if her pain became arousal, if her body betrayed her, even involuntarily, that was seen as confirmation of guilt. There's a fringe historical fact here that feels too strange to be real. In some cases, animals were used as witnesses. A woman accused of lying about her chastity might be forced to stand before a sacred relic, say the bones of a saint, or even an altar dog trained to sniff out lies. If the dog growled or barked, that was your verdict. Superstition, wearing the clothes of law, and all this, it wasn't rare, it wasn't fringe, it was embedded in the culture. It reinforced the idea that your body, your pain, was the only truth you could offer. Your voice, not enough. Your tears, suspicious. Your scars, well, those were proof you must have earned them. Scholars still debate how seriously these ordeals were taken. Some believe they were more symbolic than literal, that in many cases the accused were tested in ways that allowed for behind-the-scenes mercy. Others argue that's wishful thinking, that for countless women the ordeal was real, the burns were real, the drownings were real, and the fear absolutely real. It's hard to call something symbolic when someone dies of it. And let's not forget the showmanship. These weren't quiet proceedings, they were public events. The whole village might turn out to watch you be bound, dunked, burned. Children perched on fences, elders muttering prayers, men placing bets, women clutching their skirts tighter, pretending they weren't just one false rumour away from being next. It was justice as entertainment, morality as blood sport. You walk now through a clearing and come across the remains of a stone platform, just a few broken bricks in a mossy ring. It could have been anything once, but it looks suspiciously like the kind of place where people gathered to watch something grim. You imagine the crowd pressing close, faces lit by firelight, murmuring their judgments before the iron even touches skin. And the worst part? Even if you passed your ordeal, if you were proven innocent, the stain didn't vanish. People still talked, still watched. You might be spared the rope, but not the shame. You'd carry it like a shadow, maybe for life. You picture it. A woman standing barefoot on a wooden plank, wind whipping her hair across her eyes as the priest announces the terms. Her knees shake, not from guilt, but from knowing this is about something far older and crueler than truth. This is about control, about making an example, about forcing silence where there once was pleasure. And yet, sometimes they fought back. Not in grand ways. There were no courtroom speeches or dramatic escapes, but in small, sharp rebellions. A refusal to cry, a sideways look, A final word that doesn't beg but curses. There's a power in that, not enough to stop the system, but enough to remind it that not every woman goes quietly. As the wind picks up, rustling the trees above you, you feel the ghosts of those women walking beside you. Bound, scarred, drowned, but not forgotten. Their names may be lost, but their defiance lingers. A stubborn breath in a world that tried to choke it out, because even when the fire burns, it leaves behind embers. And embers, if you breathe just right, can still ignite. You leave the clearing behind with its broken stones and echoes of agony, but the heaviness clings to your shoulders like wet wool. The path dips through a grove of elder trees, their branches twisted like knotted fingers, and beyond that a low-roofed cottage comes into view, thatch darkened with age, smoke curling from the crooked chimney. You don't need to be told what this place is. You feel it. It's where they send you after the ordeal. If you survive, if you're lucky, this is where shame goes to rot, because now you've crossed into the bizarre, brutal world of medieval virginity tests, and the violent fantasies they spawned. You might think the obsession with female chastity couldn't get more invasive than public trials, but oh, how wrong you'd be. In this era, virginity isn't just a virtue. It's a contract, a form of currency, a proof of worth. Entire marriages, treaties, and inheritances hinge on a single biological question. Is she intact? Which, you know, is already a flawed premise. But medieval logic? Flawed and terrifying. Here's your historical fact. Many medieval societies, especially in Western Europe, believed a woman's hymen was physical evidence of virginity. If it was unbroken, she was pure. If not, well, let's just say no one wanted to hear about horseback riding, hard labour, or the fact that not every girl is born with a noticeable hymen at all. The science was bad. The assumptions were worse. Virginity tests were usually conducted just before marriage, especially for noble or royal brides. A group of midwives, matrons, or sometimes even monks, yes, monks, might be called in to examine the bride. Fingers, eyes, and judgments all over you. No medical privacy, no say in the matter. Just cold hands and colder stares. If you passed, congratulations. You're now eligible to be legally bound to a man you probably barely know. If you failed, things got complicated fast. The wedding might be cancelled, the dowry forfeited. In extreme cases, especially if someone really wanted you out of the picture, you could be cast off entirely, disgraced or punished. Now for the truly twisted fringe fact. Some newlywed couples were expected to provide physical evidence of consummation, usually blood-stained sheets. The idea was that breaking the hymen would cause bleeding, which would then be displayed the next morning like some grim little flag of honour. In some households, servants would inspect the bedding. In others, the cloth was shown to witnesses. Sometimes it was even paraded through the town. You might be thinking, there's no way people actually wanted that, but yes, they expected it. And if there was no blood, if the cloth was clean, then the question started. Whispers, accusations. Was she not a virgin after all? Did she fake it? Was her husband impotent? Did they even sleep together? The pressure wasn't just on the woman, it was on the man too. But the blame, that always slid right back to her. Let's say you're a noblewoman caught in this mess. You've been examined, doubted, and now your new husband claims the marriage was invalid because you weren't a virgin. What can you do? Well, if you're lucky and politically connected, you might be able to appeal to church court. But you'll have to prove your innocence. Again, maybe with more examinations, maybe with testimonials from your wet nurse, your governess, your childhood nursemaid. Anyone who can say they knew your virtue. It's worth noting that these tests didn't apply to men. Of course they didn't. A man's virginity was never questioned. It didn't affect his social standing, his inheritance rights, or his moral reputation. He could have slept with servants, courtesans, or half the nuns in the region, and no one would bat an eye. But a woman, her entire future could unravel because someone decided her body didn't behave the way they thought it should. And here's where things get really slippery. Because sometimes women found ways to work the system. A drop of animal blood on the sheet, a well-timed scratch, a staged flinch. These tricks weren't common, but they happened. And they point to a brutal truth. In a world that weaponized biology against you, survival sometimes meant deception. But the price was high. Even if you succeeded in convincing people, you lived with the constant threat of being exposed. Or worse, being believed, and still punished anyway. You pass the cottage now, catching sight of a woman sitting by the window, mending linens. Her face is calm, but her eyes are tired in a way that makes you ache. You wonder if she's one of the many women who failed a test she didn't deserve, who was declared impure and sent away. Maybe she lives here now, quietly, out of sight, out of grace. Maybe she still hears whispers. Maybe she still bleeds. Because here's the ugliest secret of all. This obsession with virginity wasn't really about purity. It was about control, about making sure a woman's body was accessible only under the right conditions, to the right man, for the right purpose, usually reproduction. If you showed signs of wanting sex on your own terms, the world needed a way to punish that. To label you as broken, damaged, less than. Some scholars argue that virginity was treated less as a virtue and more as a guarantee, proof that any children born from the marriage would be legitimate. That makes sense. Medieval inheritance laws were strict and paternity was everything. But others believe the obsession ran deeper, into the symbolic. The hymen as a locked gate, a sealed chamber, a treasure chest, language that made women into objects, prizes, things, and once opened, you couldn't be closed again. You follow the road away from the cottage now, the forest thickening around you. Each footstep feels like a heartbeat, steady and bitter. You can't help but imagine what it would be like to be judged by something so fragile, something so misunderstood, something that might not even exist in the way they believe it does. And what do you do with your own desire in a world like this? You bury it, smother it, or hide it behind thick veils and carefully arranged expressions. Maybe you sneak moments, quick, breathless ones. But even then you know the risk, not just of being caught, but of being tested. Because here, pleasure isn't just policed. It's inspected, measured, displayed. And if it doesn't fit the myth, then neither do you. The trees thin as you walk, giving way to gentle hills and distant banners fluttering above stone walls. A castle this time, not a convent or village. Its towers are smaller, more decorative, the kind of place where troubadours might wander through courtyards singing of love so agonizing it makes your teeth hurt. You've stepped into a different kind of medieval landscape now, one dressed in embroidered veils and satin sleeves, where desire isn't punished with fire or public shame, but with silence, longing, and impossible rules. Welcome to the strange little loophole known as courtly love. Now don't let the name fool you. It sounds romantic, like a knight kneeling in dewy grass while his beloved drops him a favour from her balcony. And yes, that happened, or at least people wrote about it happening. But beneath the poetry, courtly love was its own cage, one built of flowery language and carefully maintained distance. It was desire weaponized into performance, wrapped in silk and always just out of reach. Here's your historical fact. The idea of courtly love emerged in 12th century France, particularly in the courts of Eleanor of Aquitaine and her daughter Marie de Champagne. It was a literary invention at first, idealised love between a noble knight and a lady who was usually married, unattainable and placed on a pedestal so high she needed a ladder just to sneeze. It wasn't about sex, not really. It was about longing, endless, unfulfilled poetic agony. The knight would swear devotion, perform heroic deeds in her name, maybe write her a song or two filled with metaphors about fire and drowning and celestial pain. And she'd reward him with a glance, a touch of her sleeve, maybe a whispered word behind a pillar. The whole structure was built on restraint. You couldn't have her. That was the point. And yet, people found cracks in the system. Because under all that chivalrous agony was something that hadn't been allowed before. A woman's ability to inspire desire. Not as a temptation, not as a danger, but as a muse. A spark. A reason for knights to pick up swords and poets to pick up pens. That might sound like a win, and in some ways it was. Courtly love gave women a kind of social power, at least on paper. They could become the centre of a narrative that wasn't just about childbirth or obedience. They were objects of passion, admiration, even spiritual elevation. But there's the rub. Objects, not participants. The lady in a courtly love story rarely speaks. She listens. She responds with carefully crafted aloofness. She inspires, but she rarely feels. Her desire is irrelevant or assumed. The whole system is based on male suffering, male longing, male frustration. She is the prize, the catalyst, the cause of his suffering, but never a subject in her own right. And yet, within those narrow rules, some women slip through. There are poems, real anonymous ones, written in a female voice, They speak of aching, of waiting, of hiding desire behind the tapestry of courtly manners. A noble woman might not be able to say, "I want you," or "eat you," but she could write, "When you are gone, my breath is thin." Same emotion, different cage. One quirky historical detail. Some noble courts hosted courts of love, where ladies presided over mock trials to debate matters of romance. Real questions were posed. Can true love exist within marriage? Can a woman love two men at once? Is it better to speak your feelings or suffer in silence? These were performances, yes, but also spaces where women could shape the narrative, however briefly. Scholars still argue about whether courtly love reflected real relationships or was just elite fan fiction. Some suggest that the poetry was a cover for real affairs, that behind every ode to an unattainable lady was a flesh-and-blood lover, hiding behind a carefully arranged curtain. Others say it was more ritual than reality, a literary game everyone played because it was safer than confronting actual passion. The truth, like most things medieval, is probably somewhere in between. As you pass beneath the castle's outer wall, you catch a glimpse of a lady on a balcony. Her hair is braided in gold ribbons, her expression unreadable. Below her, a young man paces the garden in exaggerated melancholy, as if he's rehearsing heartbreak. Maybe he is, maybe he's just part of the show, but she sees him, she knows. And maybe, in her quiet room at night, she writes a verse of her own, just for herself. Because that's what courtly love allowed beneath the thorns, the idea that women could feel even if they weren't allowed to act, that their presence could stir the world even if they themselves were kept still. It's not liberation, but it is a sliver, a breath of air in a room that's been locked too long. And maybe, just maybe, it gave women a language they could steal and reshape, turn longing into letters, turn frustration into secret diaries, turn a system designed to restrain them into a place where, if only for a stanza or two, they could speak. You leave the castle behind as the sun dips lower, painting the clouds in streaks of amber and wine. The road ahead is quiet again, and so are your thoughts. You've seen women punished for desire. You've seen them examined, accused, erased. But here, in this odd little corner of poetry and pretense, they started to whisper. Not loud enough to be heard, but enough to remind the world they were still there. Because even if the world won't let you love loudly, sometimes you find ways to murmur through the cracks. The castle's silhouette fades behind you as the road dips toward the south, cutting through hedgerows and scraggly orchards. The air smells like earth and distant smoke, with the metallic tang of horses drifting in from somewhere nearby. And soon you see why. Because there, just off the main road, is a row of ramshackle buildings that barely qualify as structures. Half-timbered, straw-strewn windows like missing teeth. Outside, a pair of rough-looking men toss dice beside a door, and a girl leans in the threshold, one hand on her hip, lips parted in a cirque that's almost defiant. You've stumbled onto the kind of place people pretend not to see, a roadside brothel, or maybe an inn, or maybe both, depending on who's asking. And you're about to learn a very strange truth. Even in a world where female sexuality is punished and policed, it's still for sale. Welcome to the dark economy of desire. The medieval brothel is a paradox. It shouldn't exist, not in a world obsessed with virginity, sin, and spiritual purity. But it does. In fact, it thrives. Because while women are expected to be chaste, men are expected to be, well, not. And that contradiction builds a business. Here's your historical fact. In many medieval cities, prostitution was not only tolerated, it was regulated. Places like London, Paris, and Florence had official red light districts, where sex work was technically legal. Brothels paid taxes. Workers were inspected by city officials. Some even had designated uniforms, usually red or striped hoods, to set them apart. The church frowned, of course, but also recognised the necessary evil of such places. Better for men to visit a brothel, the logic went, than to seduce a virgin or bother a married woman. Somehow this was considered moral calculus. But what about the women inside? You step closer to the building, noticing how uneven the floor is, how patched the curtains are. The girl at the door still watches you, her eyes sharp beneath the lazy pose. She looks young, too young, and she's probably already learned to laugh at jokes that don't land, to soothe drunk men with honeyed tones, to say no in ways that don't sound like defiance. Because defiance gets you bruised. Sex workers in the Middle Ages lived in a strange twilight zone. On one hand, they were reviled, called whores, sinners, temptresses, blamed for plagues, moral decline, even demonic infestations. On the other hand, they were often protected by the very men who used them. Brothel owners could be wealthy, local officials might turn a blind eye, and some women, even some, made decent money, at least in theory. But the reality was harsh. Most of these women weren't working for pleasure or profit, they were working to survive. Some had been cast out after failing virginity tests or losing their dowries. Some were orphans, some were widows. Some had been promised jobs as servants or maids and ended up here instead, traded from one town to another like livestock. Here's a lesser-known, deeply uncomfortable fact. Some pilgrims, yes, pilgrims, those travellers on sacred journeys, would frequent brothels along the road to holy sites. The contradiction is stunning. Men walking barefoot to venerate saints would stop for a little paid company along the way. Some even argued it was a way to stay strong in their spiritual mission. You wonder how many women heard that excuse and rolled their eyes behind closed doors. You step inside now, just briefly, and the air shifts. It's warm, smoky, heavy with perfume, and something more animal beneath. A woman with grey streaks in her hair moves past you, balancing a tray of ale. Her eyes don't meet yours. She's too tired, or too practised. This is a job, just a job. But the toll it takes is etched into every line of her face. And here's where the story gets more tangled. Some women in these brothels weren't just working, they were punished. A woman caught having an affair might be sentenced to serve time in a brothel. Not prison, not exile, sex work, because that, in the minds of some lawmakers, was fitting punishment for a woman who had sinned with her body. You broke the rules, then your body becomes public property. It's almost too cruel to believe, but there it is, written in court rolls and legal records. Women reduced to a sentence of enforced sexuality, not even the illusion of consent. And yet, in the strangest way, some brothels became spaces of accidental agency. A woman might learn to read body language, to negotiate, to network. In rare cases, a seasoned sex worker might rise to manage the house, might hire other women, might set rules. These madams, while still vulnerable to abuse and legal crackdowns, had more power than many wives. They were part of an underground economy where information was traded as often as bodies. Some scholars argue that these women were more than just victims. They carved out identities within their brutal world. Others disagree, saying that framing this as empowerment ignores the exploitation and suffering at its core. The truth, as usual, is layered. For some, the brothel was a trap. For others, the only alternative to starvation. Outside again, you pass a wooden post near the brothel's corner. It's carved with initials, some crossed out, others newly etched. Messages left by men or women, it's unclear. A record of names no one else wanted to write down. You run your fingers along one. EL was here. 3 coins, no kiss. The cruelty of it lands hard, because in this world sex is everywhere, but pleasure is nowhere. Women who want sex are punished. Women who don't are forced, and women who agree for money, survival, shelter are turned into shadows, tools, stories told in a language they never chose. You walk on, the brothel shrinking behind you, its laughter and music turning thin in the air, and you wonder how many of those women will die with no name, no grave, just a rumour that they once touched someone who never looked them in the eye. Because in a world where female desire is feared, female survival becomes its own kind of rebellion. Quiet, unseen, and sometimes bought by the hour. You follow the road east now, through flat lands stitched with wildflowers and wheat, the golden fields swaying in the breeze like a sea you can wade through. The chaos of the brothel feels far behind, but it clings to your thoughts, its mixture of forced smiles and weary resignation. But now the air smells different, fresher, greener, and there's a little more bird song, a little less tension in the wind. It draws you toward a village that feels quieter, more inward, where the cottages have herbs strung along their beams and the gardens are thick with plants that aren't just for flavour, they're for secrets. Because this is where the midwives live, the healers, the herb women, the women who carry knowledge in their calluses and tuck mysteries into the folds of their aprons. And if you're a woman who enjoys sex, or needs help avoiding its consequences, this is probably who you come to see. You pass a garden so overgrown it looks like it's trying to eat the house. Lavender, rue, sage, mugwort. The air hums with the smell of it all, sweet, bitter, medicinal. You pause at the gate and an old woman peers at you from the shadows of her doorway. She's not smiling exactly, but she's not surprised to see you either. Like she's been waiting. Because this isn't just any garden. This is one of the last safe places for women who want to know their own bodies, and for women who want to choose what happens to them. Here's your historical fact. Medieval midwives weren't just birth attendants. They were community doctors, spiritual counsellors and keepers of women's knowledge, especially when it came to sex, reproduction, and all the messy, miraculous things in between. They knew which herbs could help a pregnancy along, which ones might quietly end one, and which could dull desire when necessary. And this knowledge, it was power, dangerous power. Not everyone trusted them. The church was deeply suspicious of any woman with too much understanding of the body, especially the female body. And while midwives were often licensed by the church in later periods, those licenses came with restrictions. They had to swear oaths. Promise not to use magic, not to perform abortions, not to speak certain words or offer charms. Of course, many still did, because real life doesn't always leave room for obedience. You walk around the side of the house, past baskets of drying roots and strings of garlic so fat they look like talismans. Inside, you find a room lined with jars. Dried flowers, powders, oils, labels scratched in messy Latin or the local dialect. This is where women come when they've missed a period, when their husband is away but their belly grows anyway, when they ache from too much or too little, when they want to feel something and don't know how to ask. It's hard to overstate how important this kind of knowledge was in a world that treated women's sexuality like a disease. The midwife could offer a tea that took the edge off lust, or if needed, one that stirred it up. She knew how to brew moonwort into a draught that made the womb release. She might call it a medicine. The priest might call it murder, but she called it mercy. Here's your quirky fringe fact. Some midwives used astrology when deciding when to administer certain herbs or perform procedures. They watched the moon's phases, tracked planetary alignments, and read birth charts, not because they were superstitious, but because this was part of their medical tradition. The stars, the plants, the body, they were all connected. The church, naturally, hated this. And yet people kept coming, even priest sisters, even noble women in fine cloaks sneaking in at twilight. Because desire doesn't care about class, and fear doesn't care about vows. You run your fingers along a shelf where a little scroll lies half unrolled. The handwriting is cramped and faded, but the words leap out, a tincture for after bleeding when the belly begins to swell. No explanation, no judgment, just an answer. This is how knowledge survived, not in official books, but in scraps and whispers and recipes passed down like family heirlooms. But this power came with risk. The same knowledge that helped women also made them targets. If a baby was born dead, the midwife might be blamed. If a woman confessed something scandalous during labour, the midwife might be accused of hearing it too kindly. And if she gave someone herbs that worked too well, that was practically witchcraft, wasn't it? Scholars debate just how many midwives were caught in the crossfire of witch hunts. Some say the connection is overstated, others insist it's central. What's clear is that many of the women accused of being witches were exactly the sort who helped other women, the ones who knew how to read symptoms, soothe pain and deliver inconvenient babies in the middle of the night without asking too many questions. And yet despite the danger, these women kept working, quietly, steadily. With courage that doesn't look like sword fights or grand speeches, courage that looks like placing a warm hand on a frightened girl's back and saying, "Drink this, you'll be all right." You leave the house slowly, stepping back into the garden as bees hum lazily between blooms. The old woman has returned to her chair by the door, shelling beans now, as if she didn't just offer a lifeline to someone who had nowhere else to go. Her gaze follows you briefly, then returns to her hands. She knows she's necessary. That's enough. And you realise as you walk on that the real rebellion wasn't in the brothels or the poems or even the court trials. It was here, in these quiet rooms, in these bitter brews, in the knowledge passed hand to hand, mother to daughter, sister to sister. The kind of power that's not written in laws but in the veins of leaves and the wisdom of women who've been silenced too long. Because sometimes survival isn't about fighting. Sometimes it's about knowing, and sharing what you know with someone who needs it, even when the world tells you not to. You walk until the herbs and fields fade behind you, until the warmth of the sun turns heavy and thick, pressing into your skin with a sleepy kind of weight. A river winds alongside the road now, slow and silver, flanked by the weeping willows whose long branches trail the surface like fingers. A bend in the path leads you to a low stone bridge, mossy and worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. And there, perched beneath its arch, is a man in black, hunched over a bundle wrapped in burlap, murmuring words you can't quite hear. Another figure kneels beside him, head bowed, hands clasped, eyes wide and wet. A woman. She's whispering too. You don't need anyone to tell you what's happening. You've arrived at the place where sin gets swallowed, where guilt is passed off like a worn garment. This is a sin-eater's place, and the bundle beneath the priest's hand is likely a body, washed, anointed, and still warm. But it's not just the dead who bring sins here, it's the living, too. Especially women who dared to want, to take, to enjoy. And now they come to confess in the only way they're allowed, through ritual, through shame, through someone else's stomach. The sin-eater himself is silent. He unwraps a loaf of bread, places it on the corpse's chest, then pours a thin stream of ale across it. The woman sobs harder now. You edge closer, trying not to make a sound, as the man begins to chant, low, guttural, almost indifferent. Then he eats, slowly, methodically, bite after bite, washing it down with the ale that now tastes like fear. He's taking it all in, not just the dead woman's sins, but the guilt no one wanted to name. Because in the world you're standing in, desire is a sin that sticks, even in death. Here's your historical fact. The practice of sin-eating existed in parts of Britain, particularly Wales and the border counties, as a folk ritual meant to cleanse a soul before burial. Though not officially sanctioned by the church, it was tolerated in rural communities where tradition and desperation often outranks doctrine. The sin-eater, usually a poor man socially shunned, would eat bread and drink ale placed on or near a corpse to symbolically absorb their sins, allowing the deceased to pass on clean. A spiritual stomach. In a sense. But there were whispers that some sin-eaters did more than feast for the dead. Some were said to hear confessions before death, quiet words passed into ears that never repeated them, especially from women who had nowhere else to turn, women who couldn't speak to their priest without fear, women who couldn't name what they'd done, what they'd felt, without risking fire or exile, or worse. You move slowly toward the grieving woman now. She rocks back and forth on her knees, muttering something that sounds like a prayer, or maybe a list, a name, night. Touch she still feels when she closes her eyes, the way her body betrayed her with pleasure. The guilt gnaws at her, even though the man she touched is likely still alive, walking free, untouched by judgment. But her, she's here at the river, kneeling in dirt, hoping a stranger's bite can carry her shame away. It's easy to see this as pathetic, as tragic. But there's more to it than that, because sometimes confession is the only power a woman has left. When the church owns your body and the law ignores your voice, confession becomes your last tool. Not to demand justice, there's little of that here, but to reclaim the story, even if only whispered to a man who will never look you in the eye, a man who will eat your secrets and never speak them. Here's a peculiar fringe fact. Some sin-eaters were believed to suffer physically for the sins they consumed. They were said to grow sick, to wither, to age prematurely. In some tales, their stomachs bloated or turned black. They were pariahs, often avoided even in life, and never buried in consecrated ground. The irony? They carried more spiritual burden than most priests, and they were paid in crusts and silence. The woman beside the river stands now, wiping her face with the sleeve of her gown. She drops a coin into the sin-eater's cup, then turns and walks away without a word. Her steps are shaky, but something in her shoulders is lighter. Maybe it worked, or maybe she just needs to believe it worked. Because when you've been told your pleasure was a sin, even a mock sacrament feels like salvation. The sin-eater finishes the last bite, wipes his mouth and packs his things. He doesn't look at you as he walks past. His eyes are fixed on nothing, as if he's trying to forget the taste. Or maybe to forget how many women have come to him with trembling lips and stories too heavy to keep. Scholars debate whether sin-eating was symbolic or believed to be literal spiritual transfer. But what no one questions is that it filled a gap. The official church didn't offer absolution for women who confessed to enjoying sex. Repentance was supposed to come with pain, suffering, denial. But here, by the river, the rules changed. For a coin and a crust, a woman could be heard. Not forgiven, maybe, but heard. And maybe that was the real miracle. You walk up to the spot where the body lay. Only a smear of ale darkens the stone. The air is thick with the scent of yeast and something more sour. You think of how many women passed through this place. How many couldn't die in peace without someone to carry away the secret curled tight in their belly. How many still lived with that secret, smiling politely in church, cooking for their husbands, pretending their desires had never spoken out loud. But they had. You know that now. You've heard their confessions in the wind, in the margins, in the way the world bent just slightly around them. Bent, but didn't break. You step back onto the road and keep walking, the river whispering beside you. And you think, in a world that punished women for speaking, even a single muttered truth, consumed in bread and buried in a stranger's gut, was a kind of freedom. The river fades behind you, narrowing into a trickling stream swallowed by reeds. And now the land rises again. Gentle slopes dotted with grazing sheep and the occasional stone fence, mossy and crumbling. A breeze picks up, cooler now, lifting your hair and bringing with it the scent of something floral but sharp, like crushed violets laced with smoke. You crest the hill and see it, a bustling village square ahead, louder than any place you've passed in days. Traders shout prices, geese honk from their pens, and a blacksmith hammers rhythmically at a blade on his anvil. But it's not the clamour that catches your attention. It's the way the women move. They don't slink along the edges like shadows here. They glide, they stroll, they flirt. You watch one, maybe 16, maybe older. It's always hard to tell, and in a world where time weighs heavier on some, smiling with open mischief at a boy juggling apples. Her bodice is laced high, but her eyes are not modest. She knows exactly what she's doing, and no one looks scandalised. You blink, you've stepped into a pocket of freedom. But don't mistake it for full liberation. This isn't utopia, it's something subtler. A place where fashion, posture and glance serve as currency. Where women don't declare their desire aloud, but wear it woven into fabric and sewn into seams. This is flirtation as survival, as strategy as art. Tonight's focus is all about appearance, how medieval women used fashion and body language to navigate a world that punished desire, yet obsessed over its symbols. Because when you can't say what you want, you find ways to show it, carefully. Let's start with the historical fact. Clothing laws in the Middle Ages, known as sumptuary laws, were very real, especially in cities. These dictated what people could wear based on their class, gender and marital status. For example, a married woman might be required to wear a veil or a wimple in public to signal her availability had been claimed. A widow might wear black. Prostitutes might be forced to wear striped cloaks or bright yellow hoods. It was all about signalling. Your fabric spoke before you did. But here's the twist. Women learned how to speak through those rules. They embroidered hidden messages into their sleeves. They loosened laces just enough to suggest, but not expose. They used colour and texture and fit to say things that would have gotten them stoned if spoken aloud. A glimpse of ankle, scandalous, but also deliberate. A belt tied high beneath the bust suggested pregnancy or made the waist look smaller. Bodices were designed to lift and press. Chemises, thin underlayers, became tools of tease, slipping off one shoulder during a dance, accidentally transparent after a rainstorm. And then there were eyes. Oh, the eyes. A single look could light a fire. Medieval poetry is littered with references to piercing glances and eyes like arrows. A woman might be silent in church, lips moving in prayer, but if her eyes lingered one breath too long on a scribe across the aisle, the air between them caught fire. Of course it was dangerous. The line between coquetry and condemnation was razor thin. One wrong glance, one too loose bodice, one rumour about your smile, and suddenly you were a seductress. Or worse, a witch. But still, women played the game, because what choice did they have? Here's a delightful, if slightly absurd, fringe detail. Some young women carried small mirrors, either sewn into their sleeves or hidden in their belts, to check their reflections throughout the day. Not for vanity, not entirely, but to ensure they looked the part, that their hair curls hadn't fallen flat, that their cheeks still held a bit of colour. In a world where power came in hints and innuendos, even a smudged coal line could tip the balance. And hair. Don't get started on hair. For unmarried girls, long flowing locks were a symbol of youth and innocence. But let it loose too often, and people started asking questions. A plait undone in public could be seen as a sign of seduction. Some married women, especially in cities, were expected to keep their hair hidden entirely. A wimple was not just modesty, it was a muzzle for beauty. But of course not every rule was followed, not every hem stayed low, and not every glance went unreturned. As you walk through the market square, you notice a pair of women haggling over a length of blue velvet. One, older, clucks her tongue and mutters something about how only a lady of questionable repute would wear that shade. The younger one snorts and buys it anyway. Her smile says everything. Maybe she'll use it to line a new overdress. Maybe she'll turn it into a ribbon to tie in her braid. Either way, it will say something, and that message won't be for just anyone. There's debate among scholars about how much agency medieval women really had when it came to fashion and appearance. Some argue that the restrictions were so severe, so church-enforced, that women had no real choice. Others counter that women were endlessly resourceful, that they found a kind of freedom in constraint, that what looked like obedience was often performance, camouflage, code. You pause near a stone fountain, watching as a girl dips a jug into the water. The neckline of her gown is modest, but the curve of her collarbone is visible. She catches a boy watching, then turns slightly, just enough to make the line of her throat more obvious. Nothing happens, no touch, no words, but the air crackles. That's the real power of this moment in history. Not rebellion through fire, but rebellion through flirtation. Not loud declarations, but silent control. A woman who couldn't say "I want" could still make herself wanted. Could still hint, with a tilt of her head or a twist of fabric, that there was more to her than prayer and propriety. You leave the square as the vendors begin to pack up their wares, carts rattling along cobblestones, sky softening into dusk. The wind picks up again, and you catch your reflection in a piece of mirrored glass resting on a vendor's cloth. Your hair is wind-blown, your expression unreadable, you look like someone with a secret. And maybe that's what medieval women mastered better than anyone, the art of having secrets in plain sight, of using the tools they were given, cloth, colour, body language, to bend the rules just far enough without breaking them, to enjoy a glance, to savour a smile, to play. Because even when the world says be modest, your eyes can still say watch me. The road grows quieter as twilight settles in, washing the world in that strange in-between light, neither day nor night, just a soft grey where shadows stretch longer than they should. You walk along a crumbling stone wall lined with thorn bushes and tangled ivy, your thoughts still heavy with the glances, laces, and subtle rebellions of the village women behind you. But up ahead, a smaller cottage stands alone on a hill, its windows shuttered and its garden gone to seed. The door creaks in the wind, and beside it hangs a rusted horseshoe, nailed there upside down, meant to ward off misfortune, though clearly it didn't work. This is a widow's house. You don't need a sign, you feel it. There's something different about this place. Less frantic, less watched. No children shrieking, no husband shouting, just quiet. For a woman in the medieval world, widowhood is strange territory. It's grief, yes, but it's also freedom. And if you're lucky, or careful, it's a second chance to live on your own terms. You step through the broken gate and onto the worn path leading to the door. Inside you find what you expect. Simple furnishings, a few faded tokens of a life shared, maybe once happily, maybe not. A wooden comb, a child's discarded toy, a locked chest. But something else hums under the surface. The feeling of a woman who's no longer afraid to breathe. Here's your historical fact. Widows in medieval Europe occupied a unique legal and social category. Once a woman's husband died, she was often granted a level of independence she had never experienced before. She could sometimes own property, make legal decisions, and in certain regions, even conduct business in her own name. No father, no husband, no male guardian. For the first time in her life, she belonged to herself. But of course, it came with caveats. This freedom was conditional, temporary. It was expected that a widow would grieve, maintain a modest lifestyle, and ideally remarry. Quickly if she was young and childless, slowly if she was older, but always with decorum, always with humility. If she took too long to remarry, people whispered. If she chose not to remarry at all, they gossiped. And if she enjoyed her freedom too much, wore colour, danced at a festival, took a lover, well then she was something dangerous. You move deeper into the house, brushing dust from a table scattered with dried petals and cracked glass. A single candle, long since melted to a stub, sits unlit. In the corner a heavy cloak hangs from a hook, and on the bed, a letter. Unfinished. The ink faded but legible. It begins with "My Sweet" and stops midline, after the word "touch." You stare at it for a long moment. This is the part no one talks about. The widow who doesn't mourn in black for the rest of her days, who doesn't shrivel into piety and self-denial, who after burying the man she was bound to finds she still wants, still desires, maybe for the first time freely. And the world hates that. Because a widow, especially one with land or money, is a wild card. She doesn't have to listen to anyone. She might hire help. She might refuse suitors. She might sleep alone or not. Her desire, once tethered by the marriage, now floats loose, untamed, and people don't like untamed women. You step outside again, and the sky is nearly black. A few stars blink into view, and the wind picks up, stirring the tall grass into a whispering chorus. You think of all the widows scattered across this countryside, the ones who took lovers in secret, the ones who swore off men entirely, the ones who took in foundlings or brewed illegal wine, or wore their late husband's boots when no one was watching, and the ones who didn't survive their freedom, because while widowhood could be a window, it could also be a trap. If a woman inherited too much, she might be accused of foul play. If she resisted a remarriage arranged by her late husband's family, she might lose her home. If she was seen walking with a man not yet her betrothed, especially after dusk, people might accuse her of seduction or witchcraft or worse. There's a case in 14th century England of a widow named Alice who inherited a small farm after her husband died. She kept the land, hired workers, and even petitioned the local court when a neighbour tried to fence off part of her pasture. But then she refused a marriage proposal from a younger man. 2 months later, she was accused of bewitching his cows. No proof, no evidence, just a woman with agency and a man with a bruised ego. That's the thing. A woman with nothing to lose is terrifying to people who've spent their lives keeping women afraid. And yet some scholars argue that widows were among the most quietly powerful figures in the medieval landscape. They sponsored churches, funded schools, arranged marriages for their nieces, hired scholars. Some even joined convents, not out of piety, but as a way to lock in their independence. Others stayed in their homes, ruled their land, and never apologised for it. One quirky little fact. In certain regions of Italy, widows were legally allowed to wear brighter colours than unmarried virgins. Scarlet sometimes, or emerald. Not because they were allowed to be flashy, but because they were no longer expected to be pure. A strange backhanded acknowledgement of their freedom. You wonder how many women leaned into that, draping themselves in deep hues and walking through town like a storm people pretended not to notice. You make your way down the hill as the night deepens, a sliver of moon rising behind the distant trees. The cottage grows smaller behind you, just another shadow among many. But you carry something with you now, a new understanding, that sometimes freedom doesn't come with fire or fury, sometimes it comes with absence, with the removal of chains that once looked like love. The widow's desire may not be loud, it may not be young, but it's there, waiting, stirring in the stillness, and now no one owns it but her. The moon is high now, casting a silvery glaze over the land, softening the world into a dreamscape where nothing looks quite real. Trees stand like still dancers along the edge of the path, their shadows long and crooked. The wind has gone quiet, the kind of stillness that seems to wait for something, like a held breath. You've wandered far beyond the village limits, far from the gossip and markets and sanctioned rituals. Ahead, on a ridge overlooking a hollowed valley, stands a crooked wooden chapel long abandoned. The door is missing, the roof slumped, and weeds grow wild through its cracked flagstone floor. But it's not the building that catches your attention. It's the stone circle just beyond it, ringed with bone-white tree trunks and lit faintly by the stars. This is the place they whisper about, the kind of place they warn their daughters away from. And tonight, you're going to understand why. Because for all the sin-eaters and virginity tests and licensed midwives, there was one fear that ran deeper than all the rest. That a woman who enjoyed sex, openly, vividly, unapologetically, must be in league with something unholy, and sometimes they meant that literally. Welcome to the territory of devil lovers, demonic births, and the myth of women who bedded the devil himself. Now, Let's get something straight right away. There were no actual demon hookups happening in these forests, but that didn't stop medieval Europe from spinning tale after tale of women who, through lust, curiosity or sheer defiance, had summoned dark forces into their beds. And not metaphorically, literally. Scholars called it incubi visitation. The people, they just called it evil. Here's your historical fact. Belief in incubi and succubi, demons that preyed on humans sexually, was widespread during the Middle Ages, fueled by church writing, folklore and trial records. An incubus was a male demon who seduced or assaulted women in their sleep, sometimes leaving them pregnant. A succubus did the same to men, stealing their vitality. These ideas weren't treated as fairy tales. They were considered legitimate explanations for nighttime emissions, unwanted pregnancies, or even sexual dreams. A woman who moaned in her sleep might wake to find herself accused of inviting the devil into her chamber. And the worst part, some women confessed to it, not because it was true, but because they were terrified, or broken, or tortured into saying what the inquisitors wanted to hear. You step into the stone circle now, the grass underfoot damp with dew, and imagine what this place might have been to those who feared it. Maybe a gathering spot, maybe nothing at all, but that doesn't matter, does it? Fear doesn't need evidence, it just needs suggestion. And nothing suggested sin like a woman who couldn't explain why her body craved what it wasn't supposed to. Some cases of demonic visitation were based on real phenomena. Sleep paralysis, for example, or erotic dreams misunderstood as supernatural encounters. But in a world where female sexuality was forbidden, the idea that it came from outside the woman, possessing her, attacking her, was oddly comforting. It wasn't her fault. She was a victim, or a vessel. But others weren't granted that mercy. Some women were accused of inviting the devil into their beds, of seducing him, of making pacts sealed not with blood, but with lust. They were burned, drowned, interrogated, their bodies inspected for devil's marks, small birthmarks, moles, or scars believed to be evidence of demonic touch. If a midwife found one in the wrong place, that could be the end. One of the most famous examples comes from the 15th century. A woman named Jeanne was accused not only of witchcraft, but of giving birth to a child with a pig's foot. The child didn't survive, but the story did. They said she'd laid with Satan himself, that she'd summoned him with herbs, danced beneath a full moon, and welcomed him into her bed. What really happened? Likely a tragic deformity, or a cruel fabrication. But once the rumour started, it didn't stop. Jeanne was executed, her ashes scattered so she couldn't rise again. You might think these stories are rare, edge cases carved out of hysteria, but they're not. They show up in inquisitorial records, sermons, moral treatises, in dusty manuscripts written by trembling monks who claimed to know what sin looked like. And too often that sin looked like a woman who wanted. Here's your quirky fringe fact. One 13th century treatise actually describes the devil as taking pleasing form when visiting women, including the ability to make his body feel warm and human, and even arousing delight. The author then spends multiple paragraphs trying to shame women for enjoying it, as if they were supposed to resist a supernatural shape-shifter in their dreams with ironclad moral resolve. You have to laugh, just a little, at the absurdity, then cry because the punishment wasn't absurd at all. But these stories served a purpose. They reinforced the message. Desire is dangerous. If you crave pleasure, you risk damnation. If you act on that craving, you invite evil. And if you enjoy it, truly enjoy it, well, then you're already lost. Some scholars believe these tales were metaphorical, a way for society to grapple with repressed sexuality, female power, and fear of the unknown. Others argue the church used them as weapons of control, branding women as sinners to keep them docile. Either way, the effect was the same. Women who stepped outside the box were shoved into the fire. You kneel in the stone circle now, pressing your palm into the damp earth. Nothing stirs, no demons, no monsters, just the quiet sound of your own breath. But you can feel the weight of the stories, the centuries of fear layered into the soil. And you understand that the real devil wasn't some horned beast slipping into bedrooms. It was the idea that a woman's desire made her dangerous, that her pleasure marked her for destruction. You stand and walk back to the path, moonlight shimmering on the grass. Behind you, the chapel slumps deeper into ruin. The stone circle falls still again, and you think, maybe the devil never came for those women, maybe the men did. Morning creeps in pale and slow, curling its light over the landscape as if reluctant to commit. The stone circle and crumbling chapel are far behind you now, but their weight lingers in your chest. The road ahead leads toward a larger town, bigger than the villages you've passed through. You can tell by the noise already rising on the breeze. Carts creaking, hammers striking iron, the familiar bustle of too many people trying to live on top of each other. A dog barks, someone shouts in the distance. The scent of smoke and baking bread fills the air, layered with something less pleasant. Garbage, sweat, and the faint rot of too many bodies pressed into narrow streets. This is where law lives. Not in whispered rituals or secret gardens, but in ledgers and ink. In proclamations nailed to doors. In men with seals and authority. And if you're a woman here, especially a woman accused of wanting too much, this is where your fate gets written down. But don't expect fairness. Don't expect empathy. You're about to see how the law, even when it pretends to be neutral, rarely protects women like you. You pass through the town gate beneath a carved relief of Lady Justice, blindfolded, holding scales. A lovely idea. Except her blindfold is worn crooked, and her scales are tipped just slightly to the left. Fitting, really. Because in this world the rules might look fair, but they bend hard against anyone who strays from the script. Especially if that someone is female, poor, or inconvenient. Let's get to your historical fact. Medieval legal systems were deeply gendered. While women could bring legal action in some circumstances, especially widows or noble women, the majority of laws were written by, interpreted by, and enforced by men. A woman's testimony was often considered less reliable than a man's, particularly in matters of sexuality or morality. If a woman accused a man of assault, her word might not be enough. If she admitted to consensual sex outside of marriage, she could be charged with fornication, while the man might walk away with a fine, or nothing at all. And these weren't rare exceptions, these were norms. You walk into a town square where a wooden post stands at the centre, a loop of rope hanging lazily from the top. Stocks sit nearby, weathered, splintered, waiting. This is where punishment happens publicly. A spectacle, a warning. A woman caught in adultery might be paraded through the streets. A young girl found loose might be tied in the stocks and pelted with rotten vegetables. And here's the kicker. These laws weren't even consistent. They changed from town to town, bishop to bishop. What earned you a fine in one place might get you excommunicated, or worse, in another. You wander toward the town hall where a court clerk sits beneath a canopy, scribbling into a leather-bound book. You peek over his shoulder. The entries are short, cold. Marjorie B. Accused of immodest behaviour. Witnesses present, 2. Outcome, fine, and penance. Flip a page. Elena F. Unlawful pregnancy. Claim no father. Ordered confinement. Next page. Alice, age 16, accused of tempting master's son. No further action. You read the words, but feel the lives hidden beneath them. The context stripped out. The fear reduced to ink. Here's a lesser-known detail. In many towns there were designated morality courts, often tied to the church, where women could be tried for offences related to sexual conduct. These courts operated with a veneer of religious authority, but their focus was unmistakable. Women were their primary targets. Gossip could become evidence. Pregnancy outside of marriage could be enough for conviction. And the punishment wasn't always corporal, it was often psychological. Forced public confession, isolation, fasting, wearing a penance robe for weeks, being forbidden from taking communion. In some places, you could even be forced to attend services while standing barefoot, wrapped in a white sheet like a ghost of your former self. But the biggest injustice wasn't always the punishment. It was the inconsistency. Men who committed the same acts, especially noblemen, faced minimal consequences. A lord who seduced a servant might pay a token fee. A clergyman caught in a scandal might be moved to another parish. A married man who visited brothels regularly might be laughed at, not condemned. Some women fought back. They took their cases to court, especially if they had land or a family name to wield. There are records of women suing for breach of promise, demanding compensation for broken engagements or false claims of chastity. A few even won, but most didn't. Most were distanced by the process itself, shamed, dismissed, talked over, or simply forgotten. You enter a small side chapel now, tucked between merchant stalls, where women kneel in prayer beside a wall lined with iron sconces. One of them clutches a rosary so tightly her knuckles have turned white. Maybe she's praying for forgiveness. Maybe she's praying not to be found out. The line between sinner and victim is razor thin here, and forgiveness is only offered if you know the right words and if you're willing to beg. Scholars debate how much agency medieval women really had in the legal system. Some argue that they were more active than we assume, that they navigated the court strategically, using kinship networks and social capital to push back. Others insist that for most women, especially the poor, the system was a cage built of parchment and stone, reinforced by patriarchy and cloaked in sanctimony. And looking at this town, its ledgers, its punishments, its smug clerks, it's hard to disagree. But there's another layer too. Some women found ways to manipulate the system, claimed repentance to avoid harsher penalties, pretended madness to dodge accusations, paid off witnesses, or disappeared entirely, slipping into another town with a new name and no past. Desperation breeds creativity, and survival isn't always clean. You leave the chapel and pass a wooden cart filled with bundled scrolls, records waiting to be archived. Somewhere in those scrolls are the names of women who enjoyed sex, who admitted it, who suffered for it. And their stories, reduced to footnotes, now sit unread in the dark. You stop at the edge of the square, beneath the shadows of the crooked justice carving, and look back. You try to picture the girls who stood in those stocks, the women who cried in those pews, the mothers who walked home in silence after hearing their daughters condemned. Their footsteps are worn into the cobbles, their voices still echo if you listen hard enough. Because in this world the law pretended to protect you, but more often it just recorded your fall. By the time you leave the town, your mind is buzzing with all those half-told stories, ink-smeared confessions, fines doled out like candy, the silence of women sentenced to shame instead of justice. The path beyond the walls climbs slowly upward, past a craggy bluff and into the woods again. This stretch of forest is older than anything you've seen so far, its trees gnarled and leaning, their trunks thick enough to swallow a man whole. It's quiet here, but not peaceful. It's the kind of quiet that listens back. You push forward anyway, because tonight's turn in this winding journey takes you into a place that seems almost accidental. You're heading toward the monastery, yes, another religious house. But this one isn't filled with veiled nuns or prayerful silence. This one is masculine, muscular, carved out of stone and certainty. And ironically, it's here, in the very place where women were most reviled for their desires, that their stories continue, preserved in ink by the very hands that condemned them. Because monks didn't just chant psalms and transcribe scripture, they also wrote everything they weren't supposed to talk about, including sex, including women who enjoyed it. Welcome to the paradox of the monastic chronicle, a place where celibate men dedicated to silence and purity somehow produced reams of writing about women's lust. Here's your historical fact. Many of our most vivid accounts of medieval sexual behaviour, especially stories involving women, come from the writings of monks. These men, tasked with preserving moral order, documented what they saw as sinful behaviour, but in doing so they created it as an accidental archive of female sexuality, often rich in detail, imagination, and the unmistakable scent of projection. You step into the monastery's scriptorium, a long, vaulted room filled with dust, candles, and the low scratch of quills onto parchment. Shelves are stacked with vellum scrolls, many of them bound in leather, their spines too worn to read. One monk pauses as you enter, his head bald and glistening in the candlelight. He doesn't greet you, just watches, then returns to his work. You walk past him to a table covered in open books. One shows an illustration. A woman with her hair unbound, standing beneath a tree, arms stretched upward. A demon clutches at her ankles. The caption beneath it reads, "Beware the daughters of Eve, whose eyes lead men to ruin." Subtle. But flip a few pages and the language gets even more lurid. A woman was seen dancing naked under the moonlight, her breasts like apples in spring. It trails off there, and you wonder if the monk stopped writing or just ran out of ink. These entries were supposed to be warnings, examples, cautionary tales to keep readers on the righteous path, but they drip with fascination, with detail that feels far too intimate for something witnessed at a distance. There are entire passages dedicated to describing a woman's voice, her scent, the curve of her back, all under the guise of moral instruction. Some scholars argue these accounts tell us more about the writers than the women they described, and it's hard to disagree. The language of condemnation is often indistinguishable from longing. You get the sense that the monks were writing not just to ward off temptation, but to touch it, if only with words. These chronicles became their own kind of confession, and sometimes they crossed a line. In one 12th century English manuscript, a monk recorded the tale of a lustful maiden, who upon seducing a priest, was struck dead by lightning in the middle of a kiss. Dramatic, yes, but also oddly specific. Another tale describes a woman who sighed with pleasure even during her punishment, as if her body betrayed her holiness. It's unclear whether the monk believed this, or simply couldn't stop imagining it. Here's your fringe fact. In some monasteries, monks would scratch erotic marginalia, doodles, jokes, or bizarre little scenes in the margins of sacred texts. Rabbits chasing monks, naked women tangled in vines, phallic towers. It was like medieval bathroom graffiti with better penmanship, and it suggests that for all their vows, these men thought about sex far more than they let on. You wander deeper into the scriptorium and find a smaller room, less formal, more cluttered. Letters mostly, fragments of correspondence, prayers, and tucked between them, a piece of parchment that doesn't match the others. The ink is thinner, the hand less practiced. And the words? I have tasted the heat of him, and I am not sorry. No signature, no explanation, just that single powerful line. It could have been written by anyone. A nun, a peasant, a noblewoman in secret correspondence. But here it is, hidden among the warnings and rebukes, like a single ember buried in ashes. This is what the monks never meant to do, preserve women's pleasure. But they did. In trying to shame it, they recorded it. In trying to bury it, they immortalized it. And now you're reading it centuries later, feeling the pulse of it rise from the parchment. You glance around the room, at the walls heavy with ink and silence. These monks believed they were writing morality, but they wrote obsession, fear, desire dressed in judgment, because they couldn't control it either. Some scholars call this the mirror of temptation, the idea that the more the church tried to warn men away from women, the more they had to describe the very things they feared. And in doing so, they handed those women voices they were never supposed to have. You leave the monastery as the sun breaks fully over the trees, light slanting through the high windows and cutting across the stones like scripture. Behind you, monks continue scratching out sermons and warnings, but somewhere in those stacks of parchment, 1,000 forgotten women are still whispering. Still touching back, the monastery fades behind you, a slab of stone swallowed by the trees, but the words you read still cling to your skin. That single line, I have tasted the heat of him, and I am not sorry, sits in your chest like a lit coal, impossible to forget. You walk through the woods with the weight of 1,000 scribbled stories pressing against your spine, and it strikes you now that for all the talk of sin and salvation, desire in this world wasn't just something to be feared, it was something to be contained, controlled, redirected, and when it couldn't be stopped, it was shamed. You emerge into open country again, the landscape wide and raw with rolling hills that stretch toward the horizon like sleeping giants. A shepherd moves slowly in the distance, his flock dotting the fields like shifting clouds. It's peaceful, but in your mind the silence rings with a different kind of noise, the endless echo of judgment, and nowhere is that louder than in the space where morality meets memory. Because the damage done to women who desired sex in the medieval world didn't end with bruises or whispers or exile. No, some of it went much deeper, into the heart, into the soul or soul, and worst of all, into the mind. Tonight, you're stepping into that quiet, invisible aftermath. You're looking at what it felt like to live with desire that had no name but sin. You're walking through the haunted corridors of shame. Here's your historical fact. Medieval Christianity placed heavy emphasis on internal purity, not just avoiding sinful acts, but sinful thoughts, lustful dreaming, erotic daydreams, even flashes of physical pleasure during an otherwise acceptable marital act were all considered dangerous, sometimes even mortal sins. And for women, whose desire was already treated with suspicion, this created a constant state of internal surveillance. Their bodies weren't just watched from the outside, they were patrolled from within. So what happens when you enjoy something you're not supposed to? When your body pulses with heat after a kiss you wanted, and then someone tells you you're damned, you feel shame. Not the kind that burns and fades, but the kind that roots, that calcifies, that builds a little cell inside your chest where you lock the memory away and pray no one ever finds it, because pleasure isn't just forbidden, it's yours, and you can't give it back. You reach a small stone chapel now, isolated at the edge of a hillside cemetery. Its roof is bowed, its door slightly ajar. Inside you find rows of plain benches, worn smooth by the generations of knees and elbows. At the front there's a carved wooden confessional. The curtain hangs half open, and the wood creaks under your hand as you pull it aside. The space is tight, smells like dust and old candle wax, a place designed for secrets. And this is where it happened for so many women. The confessional. The room where you turned your joy into guilt. Where you learned to rewrite your memories to fit the church's expectations. Where your desire, if spoken aloud, became sin. Women came here to confess things that today wouldn't even make a diary entry. I touched myself. I had thoughts of a man not my husband. I enjoyed the act, even when I wasn't supposed to. And sometimes the priest told them to say 10 Hail Marys and move on. But other times, especially in stricter regions or during waves of religious fervour, the response was harsher. Penance, fasting, public humiliation, the recommendation to flagellate themselves to cleanse the soul. Some women did it, believed it was holy. There's a fringe fact that might make your stomach turn. In some monasteries and convents, religious leaders kept records of habitual offenders, women who confessed to desire repeatedly. They were monitored, sometimes isolated, sometimes barred from communion, not because they acted on lust, but because they couldn't stop thinking about it. Desire was treated like a disease, and the women, incurable. And what does that do to a person? What happens when you're told again and again that your body betrays your soul? You begin to see yourself through a broken lens. You distrust your own impulses. You feel guilt for every twinge, every throb, every dream that leaves you breathless. You begin to pray not for peace, but for numbness. Not for love, but for absence. And here's where the real damage blooms, not in the moments of punishment, but in the quiet that comes after. The woman who no longer touches her husband because she fears her own pleasure. The girl who flinches when she feels warmth between her legs, even if no one is near. The widow who closes her eyes at night and tries to forget how it felt to be wanted. Shame turns desire inward until it devours itself. You sit now on one of the wooden pews, staring at the faded altar. The stained glass above you is cracked, its colours dulled, but you can still make out the face of Mary, serene, pure, untouchable, the virgin, the model, the impossible standard. And beneath her gaze, women tried to mould themselves into statues. Still, silent, holy. But they weren't. They were flesh. They felt, and they carried that feeling like contraband hidden in the folds of their skirts, in the stutter of their confessions, in the hollow ache they couldn't explain. Some women found ways to survive it. They wrote letters, journals. They whispered to one another. There are fragments, marginalia and prayer books, lines of poetry tucked inside legal documents. Small, brave reminders that someone was still there beneath the shame, that someone remembered what it was like to want and not be sorry. Scholars argue whether these inner struggles can be traced, whether we can truly access the psychology of medieval women. But their writing, scarce though it is, gives us windows. And through those windows we see not just repression, but resilience. The women who didn't erase themselves. The ones who refused to let the guilt win. You rise from the pew and step back outside. The sky has lightened into full day. The cemetery behind the chapel is quiet, its markers tilted with age. You walk among the graves, running your hand across the stones. Most bear men's names. A few are marked only wife of or mother to. Their stories are erased, or never written down at all. But you know better now. You know that somewhere in their lives these women felt, maybe secretly, maybe once, maybe often, and whether they confessed it or carried it to the grave, whether they regretted it or smiled in the dark, they were more than the silence history left behind. They were desire, and they were shame, and they were survivors. You leave the chapel grounds behind, the grass cool and dewy beneath your steps, the taste of old guilt still lingering like incense in the back of your throat. The road curves along the edge of a ridge now, giving you a sweeping view of the valley below. Farms stitched together in crooked patches, smoke rising from chimneys, and somewhere faintly the toll of a distant bell. But your eyes are drawn to a different kind of trail, not a road, but a worn footpath leading off the main route, disappearing into a thicket of pine. It's not marked, not paved, but it calls to you all the same. You follow it, because this next part of the story doesn't live in records or courts or sermons. It lives in whispers, in superstition, in soft words spoken over cups of wine and tucked into satchels sewn with bone and thread. This is where women turned to the only magic they had left, the forbidden kind, the intimate kind, the erotic kind. Because if you were a woman who enjoyed sex in the medieval world, and you survived the shame, the judgment, the risk, you might not just hide your desire, you might try to shape it, control it. And that meant charms, potions, spells. Welcome to the world of medieval love magic. Here's your historical fact. From the 12th century onward, records show the use of erotic magic throughout Europe. Women, and sometimes men, used herbs, spoken incantations, and ritual acts to attract lovers, maintain their affections, or gain power over them. These practices were often lumped into the category of folk magic, and while some of it was innocent, some crossed into deeper taboo territory, especially when it came to controlling another's desire, or amplifying your own. You step into a clearing now, surrounded by trees knotted with dangling charms, feathers, beads, scraps of dyed cloth. At the centre is a flat stone blackened by fire. Not recent, but not ancient either. Someone once knelt here, murmured something into the smoke and hoped it would work. These weren't grand spells, lifted from grimoires with Latin incantations. No, this was kitchen magic, backyard magic. Women stirred aphrodisiacs into wine, planted herbs near beds to awaken lust, wrote secret names on slips of parchment and burned them under moonlight, and sometimes, yes, they used more unusual ingredients. Hair, nails, menstrual blood, bodily fluids mixed into bread and fed to lovers. Not romantic, definitely not sanitary, but deeply rooted in the belief that desire could be summoned, bent, even bound. One strange recipe from a 15th century Italian manuscript advises a woman to wrap a man's seed in red cloth and bury it at dawn, to make him fall deeply in love, or perhaps to never stray. Another recommends rubbing marjoram mixed with goat's milk into the soles of your feet before meeting your beloved. Why? Who knows? But someone tried it. More than once. Here's your quirky fringe fact. In parts of Eastern Europe, women carved the little figurines called love dolls, not for worship, but for spell work. They would prick the dolls with pins, whisper their lover's name, and hide them beneath the bed. If it worked, the man would become obsessed. If it didn't, well, there were always stronger herbs. You walk through the clearing and find the remnants of a fire pit, half covered with moss, but still surrounded by small stones that form a crude circle. In the ash you notice something glittering. A bead, green glass, probably once sewn into a charm bracelet or a spell pouch, left behind or dropped during a ritual. A woman's fingerprints are likely still on it, buried deep under soot and dirt. And that's the heart of this moment. These rituals weren't just about controlling others, they were about reclaiming yourself. When no one else gave you permission to want, you turned to the only power you had. Even if it was risky, even if it was dangerous. Because the church hated this kind of magic. Deeply, passionately. The idea that a woman could use her own body, her own pleasure, as a source of power was too much. It undermined the whole system, and so love magic was painted as demonic. Erotic spells became acts of sorcery. Herbal knowledge became witchcraft. And the punishment, you already know it. Shame, isolation, sometimes death. Yet the spells persisted. Women passed them down in coded language, recipes that didn't look magical unless you knew how to read between the lines. Give him honey mixed with thyme before bed might be an old wives' tale, or a potion for passion. Bathe in rose water on the new moon could be hygiene or enchantment. The lines blurred, purposefully. Scholars debate whether these spells ever worked, but that's beside the point. They meant something. They were acts of intention in a world that told women they had none. They gave structure to longing, ritual to craving, and even if they didn't summon love, they gave you the feeling that maybe you weren't powerless after all. You find a satchel tucked beneath a root now, rotting from rain and time. Inside, a bundle of dried herbs tied with string, a smooth stone etched with lines, and a broken ring. Someone's altar, or offering, or secret stash. The air around it feels heavy, not with evil, but with history. You tuck it back carefully, and you think of the woman who once used it. Maybe she was lonely, maybe she was brave, maybe she was in love with someone forbidden, and this was her only chance to be touched. Maybe she'd been hurt and wanted protection before she had opened herself again. Maybe she just wanted to feel something. Because when your desire has been turned into a crime, even a small spell can feel like salvation. You leave the clearing and follow the path back toward the main road. The wind has picked up again, rustling through the leaves, brushing the back of your neck like a warm hand. You look over your shoulder once, half expecting to see someone watching, but there's no one. Just the ghosts of 100 women who refused to let their pleasure be shame, who lit fires in the woods and whispered their truths to the trees. And the trees, you think, kept every word. The road that greets you after the forest feels too wide, too exposed. After the spell-pouched trees and ash-darkened circles, the openness makes you itch. You walk faster, your boots tapping a rhythm against the paxviol, until finally the landscape shifts again. Low buildings appear ahead, clustered tight with tall fences and sharp rooftops that seem to lean in as if whispering. You are approaching a town, but not one for trade or pilgrim rest. No linen markets or bread stalls here. This place smells like ink dust and hard opinions. You've arrived at a university town, one of the few places in the medieval world where ideas could be dangerous, and women even more so. Because this is where theories are born, and this is where they're sharpened into weapons. You walk beneath a stone arch covered in ivy, into the courtyard of a school so old it looks like it was carved straight out of the hillside. Scholars in long robes pass by, arms full of scrolls, their hoods pulled tight against the wind. They don't look at you. Most wouldn't. Not if you were a woman. Especially not if they knew why you were here. Tonight, you're stepping into the lecture halls and treatises where female sexuality was dissected, debated, and, let's be honest, mostly misunderstood by men who had never touched a woman, without permission from a bishop. Here's your historical fact. Medieval universities in cities like Paris, Bologna and Oxford produced not just religious doctrine but also natural philosophy, early science, medicine and anatomy. And within those pages scholars tried to explain female desire, not by asking women, not by observing them, but by turning them into puzzles. Theories abounded, most of them absurd. You find one such volume now, left open on a stone bench in the courtyard. Its title is De Secretis Mulierum, On the Secrets of Women. Sounds promising, right? Except it was written by male clerics who had zero first-hand experience and a vivid imagination. One chapter suggests women's wombs wander if they aren't regularly satisfied. Another claims that excessive desire results in bitter humours that must be purged through bleeding or cold baths. The logic is circular, confusing and very, very male. You flip a few pages and find another gem, that a woman who enjoys sex too much might birth a child with animalistic traits, fur, claws, or excessive appetite. One even theorises that a woman's pleasure is not necessary, but if present, makes the child clever, as if intelligence were a side effect of mutual climax. It would be laughable if it weren't also terrifying, because these weren't just theories, they influenced law, medicine, and church policy. A woman who desired too much might be diagnosed with womb frenzy. A girl who reached sexual maturity too early was considered suspicious, even dangerous. A widow who didn't remarry might be treated not as independent, but as ill. Here's your fringe fact. There was a belief popular in 13th century medical texts that a woman's genitals were simply an inverted version of a man's, that the female body was a flawed, internalized mirror of male anatomy, imperfect, unfinished. Desire, then, was seen as a kind of malfunction, a symptom of physical deficiency. And if that's the framework you're operating in, then of course a woman who enjoys sex is a problem. She's not just immoral, she's malformed. You step into a lecture hall now, stone benches sloping down to a wooden platform. No candles are lit, but you can still feel the voices echoing in the cold air. A lecturer, draped in authority, pacing back and forth as he explains how a woman's craving can be spotted in her posture, her blush, her laughter, her breath. He says this to a room full of young men, boys really, and they scribble his words down like gospel. And that's the danger, isn't it? Not just bad ideas, but bad ideas taught, cemented, repeated, turned into truth because they were written with authority and bound in calfskin. Some women fought back, quietly, brilliantly. You find their marks in the margins, small corrections, rebuttals, satire scribbled in the spaces between lines. In a copy of Galen's Anatomy, someone has drawn a diagram with a note that reads, "He has never seen a woman in the summer." Another volume filled with warnings against female lust has a single phrase written in red at the bottom, "We know more than you think." There were female scholars, though rare, especially in convents, where educated nuns copied and preserved texts. Some challenged what they read, some rewrote it. A few even composed treatises of their own, arguing that women's desire was not unnatural, but divine, but those works were seldom published. Sometimes they were burned. You pause in the hallway outside the library, where a row of busts lines the wall, men with beards, scrolls and smug expressions. No women, of course, but then you see it, etched into the base of one pedestal, barely visible, a name carved with a knife. Clara, just Clara, no title, no date. But someone wanted her to be remembered. You trace the letters with your finger and wonder who she was. A student, a scribe, a lover maybe, who sat in that lecture hall and listened to her own body described like a malfunctioning machine. You walk back out into the courtyard, and the sun is setting, throwing golden light across the stones. The scholars are gone now, their scrolls tucked away, their ideas still echoing into the future. But here's the thing they never meant to do by writing so much about female desire. Even in fear, even in judgment, they admitted it existed. They tried to contain it, diagnose it, correct it, but in doing so they documented it, preserved it. And you're reading between the lines, because for every passage that claims women are weak, sinful or broken, there's another that betrays a fascination they couldn't quite smother. A tension in the text, a glimpse of recognition. And in those glimpses you see it, the truth they couldn't quite suppress, that women not only desired, they understood desire, even when no one believed them. By the time you leave the university town behind, the sky has settled into a pale lavender hue. Sunset not quite finished, night not quite begun. You walk on the edge of the road now, avoiding the cart tracks and mud, your boots damp from the grass. The air is cooler here, brushing your cheeks like a sigh, and the silence that follows you feels different than before. Not heavy, not haunted, more like a question, like the world itself is tilting its head, waiting to hear what you'll say next. Because here's the truth you've been circling since the beginning of this strange twilight walk. Despite everything, every law, every shame-soaked confession, every lecture, lash or whispered spell, there were still women who refused to be erased, who not only felt pleasure but owned it. Not in secret, not in fear, but in full view. Tonight, you're going to meet them. You come to a crossroads where the road splits into 3 directions, marked by a weathered wooden post with names half carved, half faded. But tucked just beyond the fork, sheltered under an ancient willow tree, there's a small gathering of tents, colourful ones, patched and decorated with dyed fabrics, feathers, bells. Lanterns sway gently from posts, and music, faint but real, floats on the wind. A lute, a drum, laughter. You found the travellers, the wanderers, the women who lived beyond the bounds of church and crown. You found the performers. The women here are singers, dancers, storytellers, illusionists. Some come from Romani tribes, others are vagabonds, or part of troops that drift from village to village, earning their coin in songs and smiles. And while some view them as beggars, or worse, these women hold a special kind of power because they're allowed to exist outside of the rules. Not safely, not without risk, but freely in a way most women never tasted. You sit beside a fire and watch as one of them steps into the circle. Her hair is unbound, her arms painted with swirling symbols, her waist wrapped in coin belts that jingle when she moves. She doesn't bow, she doesn't ask permission. She dances, spine like silk, hips so deliberate, a gaze that meets yours without blinking. And in that moment, there is no shame, only knowing. Here's your historical fact. Travelling entertainers, especially female ones, existed throughout medieval Europe. They performed in market squares, noble courts and festivals, offering music, dance and comedic storytelling. Though often marginalised, viewed as immoral or suspicious, they were also welcomed for the brief joy they brought. Women in these roles often lived outside traditional structures, and because they were already considered other, they had more freedom to express themselves, sexually and otherwise. But freedom came at a price. Their clothes, though modest by the modern standards, were often considered provocative simply for being bright, fitted, or adorned. Their dances, especially those involving exposed arms, bare feet, or slow movements, were called lewd. Some cities banned them from public spaces, others taxed them heavily, or forced them to register like prostitutes, and yet they kept performing, because for many this was their only livelihood, and for some it was their joy. You watch as another woman takes the stage, not to dance but to tell a story. Her voice is rich, her language earthy and vivid, and soon you realise she's not just telling a folk tale. She's describing a woman who seduced a knight by outwitting him, bedding him, then vanishing before dawn. The audience laughs, gasps, claps. It's cheeky, yes, but it's also subversive. This is storytelling as resistance, as redefinition. She's not painting the woman as wicked or broken. She's letting her be clever, desiring, whole. Here's your fringe fact. In some parts of medieval Spain and North Africa, female poets performed muwashsha, a type of lyrical poetry often centred on love and longing. These poems were sometimes addressed to other women, and though their intentions remain debated, they show that expressions of same-sex desire were not unknown, just quietly woven into art. Not preached, but preserved. You sit by the fire a little longer, sipping something that tastes like spiced mead and watching the embers flicker. Around you, women lounge with lovers, not always men. One girl leans her head on another's lap, laughing softly. Another disappears into a tent with a figure whose shape you can't quite see, and no one stops her. No one judges. They're too busy being alive. And here's the unspoken truth. Women have always created spaces like this. Temporary sanctuaries, places where desire could breathe, where it wasn't crushed under theology or reduced to diagnosis, where bodies could move without permission and pleasure wasn't a trap, it was the point. But these spaces didn't last forever. Morning would come, torches would burn low, and the road would call them forward. The outside world, its laws, its suspicion, its rage, always waited. Sometimes women like these were driven out by force. Sometimes they were accused of witchcraft. Sometimes they just vanished. Still, they existed. Their footprints are real. Their stories echo. Scholars debate whether women like these truly enjoyed the freedom we imagine. Some argue they were exploited. Their performances a mask for survival. Others insist that within these performances there was power, agency, a decision to use their bodies on their own terms, even if it was temporary. And maybe both are true, because survival and joy aren't opposites. Sometimes they happen in the same breath. You lie back on the grass now, staring up at the stars as they puncture the sky one by one. The music has faded, the fire has dimmed, but you can still feel the pulse of it in your chest. The rhythm of hips that moved without apology, the laughter that didn't ask permission, the stories that ended with women winning, not by virtue, not by submission, but by cleverness and fire. And you think, if you were born in another time, maybe this would have been your home. The road, the stage, the space between laws where desire slips through, bold and unbowed. Because even in a world built to silence them, some women sang anyway. And their voices are still singing now. Morning arrives soft and golden, the kind of light that makes everything look a little more forgiving than it really is. The camp has already begun to scatter, tents coming down, fires snuffed out, fabrics packed into carts. You pass through quietly, catching nods and sleepy smiles from the women still lingering, their eyes rimmed with last night's laughter, and a weariness that feels almost holy. They'll be on the move again soon, maybe toward another town, maybe toward nowhere in particular. That's the point. To stay in one place too long is to become a target. You step back onto the main road for the last stretch, and it feels different now, not just because you're nearing the end, but because you've seen so many versions of the same truth. You've followed women through cathedrals and kitchens, graveyards and gardens, monasteries and marketplaces. You've watched them bend under weight, rise through fire, whisper their truths into the wind, and no matter where you found them, shamed, punished, dancing, praying, hiding, they were alive with desire. That was the through line, and it could never quite be killed. So now, as the road winds toward a high hill with a scattering of stone cottages and a lonely tower at the top, it's time to ask the question you've been avoiding. What really happened to women who enjoyed sex in the medieval world? The easy answer is punishment. And sure, sometimes that was the case. You've seen the stocks, the trials, the scribbled records of penance. You've heard the sermons, read the accusations, walked the forests where sin was supposedly buried under roots and leaves. But that's not the whole story, because the truth is far messier and far more human. Here's your final historical fact. Most women who experienced and even enjoyed sex during the medieval period weren't punished publicly. They weren't all accused of witchcraft or dragged to confessionals. Many simply lived quietly, carefully, within marriages, outside them, through affairs, encounters, brief touches in the dark. They didn't speak of it. They didn't write about it. But they felt it. And they remembered. The real punishment wasn't always visible. It was internal. It was the silence. The stories they weren't allowed to tell. The way they learned to turn pleasure into guilt before it had even finished blooming. You pass a house with a garden blooming in late summer colours. Lavender, poppies, snapdragons. A woman kneels among them, pruning gently with a small knife. She doesn't look up, but you hear her humming. Something low and sweet. You wonder if she ever had a night that made her chest ache to remember. A first kiss that wasn't allowed. A child whose father no one knew. Or perhaps she never had a moment like that, but wanted one, and had to live her whole life pretending she didn't. Because for some, the punishment wasn't action, it was absence. A life so tightly bound by rules, desire never had a chance to rise. You reach the top of the hill, and there's the tower, weathered but standing. Inside is nothing special, just a stairwell curling up into shadow. You climb slowly, each step echoing beneath your feet until you reach the top, where an arched window looks out over everything. The fields, the villages, the forests, the chapels and brothels and lonely roads, all the places you've walked, and below them, all the women you've met, real and imagined, documented and forgotten. And this wide silent view is their legacy. Not because they changed the laws, not because they toppled the system, but because they survived it. Sometimes in defiance, sometimes in shadows, but always as themselves. You sit at the window and your mind starts to thread all the pieces together. The virginity tests and the herbal charms, the shame-inked confessions and the monastic porn disguised as theology, the desire that slipped into poetry, into lullabies, into recipes passed from mother to daughter, the sex workers who used pleasure as currency, the wives who learned to want on their own terms, the lovers who met in secret and never spoke their names aloud. Here's a final fringe fact. In one 14th century French text, a courtly romance told in riddles and metaphors, there's a single stanza that scholars still argue over. It describes a woman who laid with joy beneath the stars and did not ask the heavens to forgive her. No name, no context, but there it is, in the margins of history, a line that refuses to apologise. That's what remains, not the punishments, not the shame, but the refusal. Quiet, fierce, persistent. Women who refused to believe that joy was sin, that their bodies were prisons, that their desire was a curse to be hidden or burned away. You stay in the tower until the light begins to fade again, the sun dipping low and casting the land in amber, and you think maybe the real tragedy isn't what happened to women who enjoyed sex in medieval times. Maybe it's that we still ask the question with so much fear, expecting only horror. Because yes, there was pain, but there was also pleasure. And the fact that it existed, that it found a way to survive even then, is its own kind of rebellion. So when someone asks you now, what happened to those women? You can say, they were punished. Yes, but they also lived, loved, desired, whispered, danced, wrote, remembered. They didn't all survive it, but enough of them did. And now, as the stars scatter across the velvet sky one last time, you step down from that tower and walk slowly into the hush of night. There's no rush anymore. The story's been told, all 30 parts of it, stitched together like a tapestry of bruised lace and wildfire. You've followed women through moonlit meadows, past scribes with trembling pens, through smoky kitchens and into witch-haunted woods. You've seen them bound, beaten, believed and burned. but also grinning with stolen kisses and whispering secrets into the knots of old trees. You've heard the sermon, and you've heard the sigh. So what now? Well, now you rest, because tonight wasn't just history, it was a reckoning. Not just of what happened to women who enjoyed sex in the Middle Ages, but of what was taken from them, and what they still managed to hold on to. Desire, even smothered in dogma and shame, doesn't die. It goes underground. It becomes poetry. It becomes rumour. It becomes a laugh that lasts a little too long in a tavern, or a love letter hidden under the floorboard, or the smell of lavender steeped in wine on a night someone swore they'd forget. And now you know. Not all rebellions wear crowns or raise swords. Some just say, I want and don't apologise. So take that thought with you into the dark. Let it settle somewhere between your ribs. Remember the woman with ash on her fingers and a secret in her drawer. Remember the widow with ink stains and unfinished letters. Remember the girl who didn't flinch when she danced under the stars. And maybe, just maybe, remember yourself. Because the world has always tried to make certain kinds of women feel small for feeling too much. And if you're one of them, welcome to a very old, very stubborn sisterhood. Now dim your screen, close your eyes, let the night cradle you gently. You're safe, you're seen, and I'll see you again soon.